My son called me on a Tuesday morning. The connection was crisp, picking up the background hum of an airport terminal. "Dad," he said, his voice entirely too casual, carrying that light, breezy tone he used when he was trying to hide a massive failure. "We moved to another state last week, Phoenix, Arizona. Actually, we forgot to tell you." I stood in the center of my kitchen, holding the phone to my ear. I was silent for exactly 5 seconds. I processed the sheer audacity of those words. A cross-country relocation of an entire household, a pregnant wife, and a lifetime of belongings is not something a son simply forgets to mention to his father. I did not yell. I did not demand answers. I did not ask why I was suddenly being erased from their daily lives. I simply replied, "All right, son. Good luck." I hung up the phone, walked into my study, opened my laptop, and emailed my attorney with a very special attachment. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. I am Everett Calder. I am 70 years old. I spent 4 decades of my life building a logistics software empire, from a single battered desk in a cramped Cleveland apartment to a corporation valued in the tens of millions. I am a man who understands data, complex systems, and absolute security. I built my entire life on recognizing dangerous patterns and mitigating catastrophic risks. And yet, the greatest threat to my legacy had been sitting at my dinner table, eating the food I provided, for the better part of a decade. The phone call from my 38-year-old son, Preston, was the spark that illuminated a very dark room. "We forgot to tell you." Those 5 words echoed in the absolute quiet of my house. It was an insult disguised as an afterthought. As I walked down the long carpeted hallway toward my private home office, the memories of the past 8 months flashed through my mind with razor-sharp clarity. 8 months ago, Preston and his wife Corinne sat on my imported Italian leather sofa, sipping my expensive scotch and painting a flawless picture of future family bliss. Corinne had rested a manicured hand on her slightly rounded stomach and looked at me with tears welling in her eyes. "We want to raise the baby right here in Ohio," she had whispered, her voice trembling with perfect, rehearsed emotion. "Close to you, Everett. We want him to grow up knowing his grandfather, but our house in the suburbs needs so much work. It needs a new nursery, a complete structural overhaul to make it safe, and the contractors are demanding a fortune." I remembered the exact weight of my gold fountain pen as I wrote that check. $2.5 million. It was an absurd amount for a suburban renovation, but I had the liquid capital and they knew it. My late wife, Margot, had passed away 4 years ago. She had always dreamed of a house filled with the chaos and laughter of grandchildren. Her absence left a silent void in my life, a vulnerability that Preston and Corinne expertly learned how to exploit. I wrote that check, believing I was cementing our family foundation. I was securing a place for my grandchild. I handed over a literal fortune, based on the plausible lie that they were putting down permanent roots right here in my city. Now Preston was standing in an airport in Arizona, casually mentioning that they had completely relocated to Phoenix. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. The sheer disrespect was a physical blow. But I did not let my emotions cloud my judgment. I am a software engineer at my core. When a system presents a fatal error, you do not sit down and cry. You isolate the breach, and you audit the code. I stepped into my home office and locked the heavy oak door behind me. The room was completely soundproof, lined with floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves holding decades of technical manuals, patents, and corporate ledgers. I approached the third bookshelf on the left. I reached behind a vintage set of encyclopedias and pressed the hidden release switch. The heavy wooden shelf swung open silently on custom hinges, revealing the cold steel face of my wall safe. I had not opened this safe in months. There had been no reason to. It held my most vital, irreplaceable physical documents. The original deeds to my commercial properties, my corporate succession plans, a notarized backup copy of the $2.5 million check I gave Preston, and, most importantly, my medical power of attorney. That specific, highly sensitive document was drafted years ago, granting Preston the legal authority to make medical and financial decisions for me, only in the extreme event that I was completely incapacitated and unable to speak for myself. I placed my hand on the cold steel dial. I spun it sharply to the left, then to the right, feeling the familiar heavy mechanical clicks beneath my fingertips. 42, 18, 55. I pulled the heavy handle downward. The solid locking bolts retracted with a deep, satisfying thud, and the thick steel door swung open. I reached inside the dark cavity, expecting to feel the familiar stack of thick manila legal folders. My hand met empty air. I froze. I blinked, pulling back slightly, and turned on the small brass desk lamp nearby, angling the harsh light directly into the safe. It was completely empty. The entire interior shelf had been wiped clean. The backup copy of the $2.5 million check was gone. The corporate succession plans were gone, and my medical power of attorney was gone. A cold, heavy knot formed in the pit of my stomach, spreading an icy chill through my veins. To access this safe, someone would have needed the exact numerical combination and the physical brass key to the inner security drawer. I never wrote the combination down on a piece of paper. I never gave the key to anyone. Then my mind flashed back to an afternoon a few weeks ago. Corinne had come over unannounced, claiming she wanted to help me clean my office because the dust was bad for my allergies. She had insisted on wiping down the bookshelves while I was taking a long business call in the kitchen. She had been alone in this soundproof room for nearly an hour. She had watched me open it once before, years ago. She must have memorized the dial rotations and made an impression of the key I kept hidden in my desk. As I stared at the empty steel box, realizing the sheer terrifying scale of the violation, my cell phone vibrated violently in my pocket. The sudden mechanical buzz startled me in the dead silence of the office. I pulled the phone out and looked at the screen. It was an automated high-priority text message from my primary wealth management bank. The text read, "Security alert. Your primary mailing address and account control contact have been successfully changed to an address in Phoenix, Arizona. If you did not authorize this change, please contact our fraud department immediately." I stared at the glowing letters on the screen, reading them twice to ensure I was fully grasping the reality of the situation. They had not just stolen my money under false pretenses. They had not just stolen my sensitive legal documents. They were actively moving to hijack my entire financial identity across state lines. I closed the safe door with a sharp, echoing click. I walked over to my desk, sat down in my leather chair, opened my laptop, and began to type. My son thought he was dealing with a clueless, grieving old man. He thought he could pack up my legacy and steal my autonomy without me noticing. But he forgot who built the wealth he was so desperately trying to steal. I was the architect of my own empire, and it was time to initiate a complete system purge. I sat in the glow of the laptop screen, the banking alert burning into my retinas. Phoenix, Arizona. The sheer magnitude of the deception washed over me, cold and suffocating. They were not just taking my money. They were attempting a hostile, calculated takeover of my life. My mind, usually a fortress of logic and order, began to replay the past 6 months with terrifying, agonizing clarity. The signs had been there all along, hiding in plain sight, wrapped securely in the suffocating guise of filial devotion. It started shortly after I tweaked my knee during a minor winter slip on the driveway. Corinne had practically moved into the guest suite, claiming Preston was entirely too busy at his corporate job to help look after me properly. She took over the kitchen. She took over my schedule. Most importantly, she took over my daily routine. I remembered the exact tone of her voice, sickly sweet and dripping with artificial concern, echoing off the kitchen walls. "Everett, you really need to take better care of yourself," she had murmured one evening, sliding a small ceramic dish across the granite countertop. Inside sat 3 large chalky white pills. "These are special memory supplements. My holistic nutritionist completely swears by them. They promote cognitive longevity and help manage daily stress." I had swallowed them without a single second thought. Why would a father ever question the woman carrying his future grandchild? But the timeline aligned perfectly. The weeks that followed the introduction of her daily supplements were a blur of uncharacteristic, humiliating incompetence. I, a man who could once recall complex logistical algorithms from memory, began forgetting the absolute simplest things. I would walk into the kitchen and forget why I was standing there. I would misplace my car keys for hours, searching the same rooms repeatedly with growing panic. My speech would occasionally slur during evening conversations, my tongue feeling thick, heavy, and entirely unresponsive to my own commands. I felt like a prisoner, trapped inside a failing physical vessel, terrified of my own rapid decline. And Corinne was always there, always hovering in my peripheral vision. I recalled the quiet, subtle click of her smartphone camera. Every time I stumbled over a basic sentence, every time I rubbed my temples in sheer confusion, her phone was conveniently angled directly toward me. "Oh, Dad, you are just so silly today," she would giggle, tapping the glass screen. "I am just taking a quick video to show Preston how cute you are when you are tired." It was not cute. It was not a light-hearted joke between family members. It was the methodical, predatory documentation of a man losing his mind. She was building a digital catalog of my artificial decline. The realization hit me with the force of a derailed freight train. The dense fog that had clouded my brain for months suddenly lifted, burned away entirely by a massive surge of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. I pushed my heavy leather chair back and stood up. I walked out of the soundproof study and marched swiftly down the hallway toward the kitchen. They had packed up their lives in a highly suspicious hurry, leaving behind several large black garbage bags piled carelessly near the garage entrance. Wealthy people rarely take out their own trash when they are busy running away from a crime scene. I did not care about the mess. I tore open the heavy plastic bags, my hands violently sifting through discarded takeout containers, junk mail, and the mundane debris of their hasty exit. I was actively looking for the source of my sudden, inexplicable deterioration. I ripped open the second bag, completely ignoring the sharp stench of spoiled food, my eyes frantically scanning for anything related to her daily holistic routine. Near the very bottom, wedged tightly between a crumpled fashion magazine and a broken coffee mug, I finally found it. It was a crushed cardboard box, holding a foil blister pack. The packaging was completely devoid of any standard pharmaceutical branding. There was no brightly colored logo, no friendly dosage instructions, just a stark clinical alphanumeric code stamped directly on the back of the foil in plain black ink. There were 3 empty slots, the exact number of pills she had handed me on her absolute last day in this house. I gripped the blister pack so tightly, the jagged foil cut deeply into my thumb. I walked straight back to my study, ignoring the dark dirt on my hands. I sat down at my mahogany desk and opened a highly encrypted browser, bypassing the standard commercial search engines entirely. I typed the harsh string of letters and numbers into a restricted global pharmaceutical database. The search results loaded instantly, populating the high-definition screen with stark medical literature. I read the chemical composition. I read the primary applications. I did not find a holistic vitamin. I did not find an organic memory supplement. What I found was a heavy, strictly regulated neurosuppressant. It was a potent chemical compound used almost exclusively in high-security psychiatric wards to subdue violent, completely unmanageable patients. It was a dangerous drug that required 3 different physician signatures to legally prescribe in this state. The severe side effects were listed in bold red text on my glowing screen. Severe short-term memory loss, extreme motor function impairment, slurred speech, chronic lethargy, severe cognitive detachment, perfectly mimicking the aggressive onset of early dementia. I sat in the absolute silence of my study, staring at the clinical description of my own poisoning. My daughter-in-law had not been caring for me. She had been chemically lobotomizing me right at my own dining table. And Preston, my own flesh and blood, the boy I had proudly taught to ride a bicycle, the man whose entire corporate career I had financed, had stood by and watched her do it. He had smiled at me over dinner, while his wife handed me a daily dose of chemical eraser. They were not just trying to steal my financial assets. They were deliberately, maliciously, destroying my brain to ensure I could never fight back against their ultimate scheme. They desperately needed me docile. They desperately needed me compliant. They needed me legally incompetent in the eyes of the state. The casual videos on her phone were not sweet family memories. They were carefully curated exhibits for a future court hearing, to strip away my fundamental human rights. I took a slow, deep, calculated breath. The white-hot anger inside me was no longer a raging fire. It had compressed into a solid glacier, cold, immovable, and absolute. I needed to know the exact timeline of their departure. I needed to see exactly what they had physically carried out of my house the night before they fled to Arizona. I turned away from my laptop and swiveled my chair toward the secondary workstation on my large desk. This terminal was hardwired directly into the sophisticated home security mainframe I had personally designed and installed from scratch. I had placed high-definition night vision cameras at every entry point, the garage, and the main living areas. I needed the raw footage. I needed to see their faces as they robbed me blind in the dead of night. I typed in my complex master administrator credentials. The system verified and authenticated my login. I clicked on the master directory, containing the surveillance archives from the past 72 hours. But as my cursor hovered over the main video file, the entire interface completely froze. A harsh command prompt window suddenly materialized in the absolute center of my monitor. The standard blue software interface bled into a stark warning red. Lines of malicious code began cascading down the monitor at lightning speed. I recognized the destructive script immediately. It was a highly sophisticated military-grade deletion protocol, designed to permanently scrub the hard drives and overwrite the sectors with randomized data. They had deployed a digital bomb to cover their tracks. The screen blinked once, rendering a final mocking message in bold white letters across the dark glass. Files corrupted. Wipe initiated. The screen blinked its mocking message. Files corrupted. Wipe initiated. I stared at the stark red letters, feeling a grim, almost predatory calm settle over my entire body. My son had planned this incredibly meticulously. He had hired expensive professionals or purchased highly sophisticated software to deliberately scrub the local network drives, ensuring the surveillance footage of his midnight theft was permanently erased from existence. Preston always was an exceptionally smart boy when it came to aggressive corporate strategy. He understood complex acquisitions, brutal, hostile takeovers, and liquidating valuable assets. But Preston had foolishly forgotten one incredibly crucial detail about the man whose empire he was attempting to steal so callously. Long before I founded a multi-million-dollar logistics corporation, long before I wore custom Italian suits and sat at the head of gleaming mahogany boardrooms, I was a senior network security architect. I literally wrote the complex code that protected global corporate supply chains from elite international hackers. I did not just install a generic consumer-grade security system in this massive, sprawling house. I engineered it from the ground up to be completely impenetrable. I pushed my heavy keyboard aside and reached beneath the thick wooden surface of my desk. My fingers expertly found the small recessed metal panel hidden completely out of sight. I flipped the physical toggle switch. Instantly, the primary monitor went completely black. The corrupted local drive was abruptly severed from the digital display. I reached into my tailored suit pocket, pulled out a highly secure physical token drive, and inserted it into a concealed secondary port. The massive screen flickered back to brilliant life, bypassing the compromised local network entirely and establishing a direct connection to a deeply buried, air-gapped, mirrored cloud server. I had personally embedded the reinforced hardware for this redundant backup system directly into the solid concrete foundation of the house during its initial construction. It recorded everything on a continuous, unbreakable loop. It was completely invisible to the home wireless network and absolutely impervious to any remote wiping commands. My arrogant son had successfully burned down the superficial decoy house, never once realizing the actual impenetrable vault was buried far beneath his feet. I easily bypassed the initial security firewall, entered my complex biometric passcodes, and pulled up the master directory interface. The pristine, entirely uncorrupted high-definition video files immediately populated the glowing screen in perfect chronological order. I scrolled down and selected the primary security feed from my private study, time-stamped exactly 48 hours ago. It was exactly 1 o'clock in the morning. The sophisticated infrared camera captured the heavy oak door slowly swinging open. Preston and Corinne quietly slipped inside the room, moving with the cold, practiced efficiency of seasoned professional thieves. I watched my own son, the very boy I had lovingly raised, walk straight over to my hidden wall safe. He did not pause. He did not hesitate. He did not nervously search for the hidden combination. He simply reached into his pocket, casually pulled out a small piece of paper, and spun the heavy dial with absolute practiced precision. He smoothly inserted a copied brass key and pulled the heavy steel door wide open. My chest tightened painfully as I watched him systematically reach inside and remove the thick manila folders containing my most highly sensitive legal documents. Corinne stood patiently by the desk, holding a heavy brown cardboard box. She began quickly loading my confidential medical files into it, her sharp movements brisk and utterly devoid of any hesitation. I reached forward and heavily amplified the audio feed. The sensitive parabolic microphones instantly picked up their hushed, secretive voices with terrifying crystal clarity. Preston briefly paused, holding my medical power of attorney delicately in his hands. He stared down at the important document, then slowly looked over at his pregnant wife. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" Preston asked, his quiet voice betraying a microscopic fraction of lingering guilt. "Once we submit these papers, there is absolutely no turning back. We are legally trapping him forever." Corinne did not even bother to look up from the cardboard box she was meticulously packing. She let out a soft, incredibly venomous laugh that completely chilled my blood. "Preston, please," she scoffed loudly, carelessly tossing another vital file into the box. "He is a clueless old fossil. The daily sedative is already working perfectly. He can barely string a coherent sentence together after dinner. He will not know he is completely ruined until the state actually comes to collect him. By the time he finally realizes what has truly happened, we will have full legal control of the entire estate, and he will be locked safely away in a sterile memory care ward." I sat completely frozen in my large leather chair. The cold blue glow of the computer monitor illuminated the absolute undeniable destruction of my family. They were not just stealing my money. They were not just taking control of my lucrative company. They were deliberately, maliciously, orchestrating a permanent legal kidnapping. They fully intended to weaponize the judicial system against me, using the fabricated dementia they had chemically induced, to have me officially declared incompetent and forcefully committed to a psychiatric facility against my will. My own son was preparing to sign the binding legal papers, to lock me away for the rest of my natural life, simply to expedite his massive inheritance. The sheer calculating evil of their intricate plan was absolutely breathtaking. It was a hostile, merciless takeover of my very existence. The powerful sedative was the key to their entire operation. They desperately needed a legitimate medical paper trail to properly justify their extreme actions. They needed documented clinical proof of my sudden rapid cognitive decline. If I could manage to get a certified blood test immediately, I could legally prove that I was being actively poisoned with unauthorized dangerous neurosuppressants. I could blow their fabricated medical narrative completely out of the water and have them arrested for criminal assault before they could execute their final maneuver. I needed to move incredibly fast. The toxic chemicals were likely already filtering out of my system, since they had abruptly stopped administering the daily pills when they hastily fled to Arizona. I grabbed my desk phone and quickly dialed the private direct number for my longtime personal physician, Dr. Whitfield. He was the only medical professional I entirely trusted. The line rang twice before his head receptionist, a kind woman who had known me personally for over 15 years, finally answered the call. "Dr. Whitfield's office. This is Delia speaking. How may I help you today?" I kept my voice perfectly level, deliberately suppressing the mounting panicked urgency. "Delia, this is Everett Calder. I need an emergency medical appointment with the doctor today. I need a comprehensive immediate toxicology screening and a full metabolic blood panel drawn as soon as legally possible." There was a long, profoundly uncomfortable pause on the extremely quiet other end of the line. The heavy silence stretched out, thick, with absolute undeniable confusion. When Delia finally spoke, her voice was deeply hesitant, nervous, and utterly bewildered. "Mr. Calder, I am so incredibly confused. Your son called our office directly, exactly 3 months ago. He officially transferred your entire medical history and all of your active sensitive prescriptions to a new exclusive primary care clinic down in Phoenix, Arizona. He confidently said you were relocating there permanently to receive highly specialized cognitive treatment in a secure private facility. He explicitly told us you were no longer capable of managing your own health care, and he provided the paperwork to prove it. I did not panic. I simply reached over and severed the main power line to the compromised terminal, plunging that half of the room into absolute darkness. They had covered their digital tracks with the precision of a corporate sabotage team, but they had fundamentally misunderstood the entire operational board we were currently playing on. I immediately picked up my personal secure mobile phone and quickly bypassed my standard contact list, scrolling down to a hidden number I reserved strictly for existential corporate threats. Nathaniel Rourke was not the kind of attorney you called to draft a simple will or review a standard vendor contract. He was a ruthless, brilliant tactician who operated exclusively in the high-stakes arenas of commercial litigation and hostile corporate takeovers. He was a man who understood the mechanics of power and destruction. When he walked through my front door, at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, he did not look like a man who had been dragged out of bed. He was sharp, fully awake, and carrying a heavy leather briefcase that likely contained the legal firepower to bankrupt a small nation. I led him straight into my study and locked the heavy oak door behind us, ensuring absolute privacy for the critical conversation that was about to take place. There were no tears. There was no emotional breakdown. I did not ask him how a father survives the ultimate betrayal of his only son. Instead, I handed him the crushed blister pack of neurosuppressants and a printed hard copy of the server logs, detailing the exact moment the wiping protocol had been triggered. I explained the situation with the clinical detachment of an auditor, presenting a quarterly loss report. I told him about the sudden move to Arizona. I told him about the stolen medical power of attorney. I laid out the entire sequence of events with absolute chilling clarity, leaving no room for doubt or misinterpretation. Every word I spoke was a calculated strike against the illusion of my perfect family. Nathaniel listened in complete silence, his sharp eyes flicking between the pill packaging and the printed data logs. When I finished, he opened his briefcase and pulled out a secure, encrypted laptop. He did not offer empty platitudes or false comfort. He simply asked for the exact date and routing number of the $2.5 million check I had written to Preston for the supposed home renovations. I provided the information from my secure banking portal. Nathaniel accessed a series of restricted property databases, his fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced predatory speed, hunting for the digital footprints they had undoubtedly left behind in their frantic rush to execute their complex and malicious financial scheme. For 15 minutes, the only sound in the soundproof study was the rapid clicking of keys. Finally, Nathaniel stopped. He turned the laptop screen toward me. The document displayed was a property deed registered in Maricopa County, Arizona. It was for a sprawling, ultra-modern luxury estate located in one of the most exclusive gated neighborhoods in Phoenix. The purchase price was listed as exactly $2.4 million. The transaction had been executed entirely in cash just 3 days after my check had cleared Preston's account, but the name of Preston was nowhere on the deed. The sprawling property was registered to a newly formed limited liability company named Sable Ridge Holdings. I stared at the screen, analyzing the corporate registry documents attached to the deed. The sole managing member and registered agent for Sable Ridge Holdings was Corinne. My daughter-in-law had taken my money, bypassed my son entirely on the legal paperwork, and purchased a massive Arizona estate solely under her own control. The renovation story was a complete fabrication from the very beginning. They had never intended to stay in Cleveland. They had never intended to build a nursery in their suburban home. They had meticulously planned this cross-country escape for months, funding their luxurious new life with my money, while actively poisoning me at my own dinner table to prevent any retaliation. It was a staggering level of deceit, executed with the cold precision of seasoned criminals operating without a single shred of human conscience. Nathaniel did not stop there. He leaned back over the keyboard, his expression hardening into a mask of pure, concentrated focus. "If they went through the trouble of stealing your physical power of attorney," he murmured quietly, his eyes scanning rapidly across multiple database windows, "they are not just stopping at a simple cash grab. That document is a blank check for total financial control across state lines. I need to run a deep diagnostic on your commercial real estate portfolio immediately. Your liquid assets are secure behind the biometric firewall, but your physical properties might be incredibly exposed. They could easily leverage those buildings for massive amounts of capital without your knowledge, creating a cascade of catastrophic debt." I watched him work, feeling the cold, glacial anger solidifying further in my chest. I had spent over 30 years acquiring prime commercial real estate in the downtown district. Office buildings, high-end retail spaces, massive warehouses that generated a constant, reliable stream of passive income. Those properties were the absolute bedrock of my wealth, entirely separate from my logistics software company. They were the tangible legacy I had carefully planned to leave behind for future generations. Now they were potentially vulnerable to a piece of stolen paper. I refused to let them dismantle my life work and drag my hard-earned reputation through the mud for their own selfish, unbelievable greed. The silence in the room stretched out thick and suffocating as Nathaniel cross-referenced public records, county liens, and federal banking registries. He was searching for any unauthorized encumbrances or sudden transfers of ownership. The meticulous thoroughness of his search was a stark reminder of the massive financial empire I had built, and the immense danger it was currently in. Every passing second felt like an eternity as I waited for the digital verdict. I kept my breathing even, refusing to let the mounting tension fracture my composure. I had faced hostile takeovers before, but never from my own blood. This was a completely different kind of warfare, requiring an entirely new level of strategic ruthlessness and absolute unwavering resolve. He stared at the screen for a long, agonizing moment. The color slowly drained from his face, leaving him looking unusually pale and visibly shaken. The ambient hum of the encrypted laptop seemed deafening in the sudden stillness of the private office. He took a slow, deep breath and finally looked up at me. His dark eyes locked onto mine, reflecting a level of absolute shock I had never witnessed in him before. His voice, usually so commanding and absolute, was tightly controlled and profoundly grim. "Everett," he said slowly, choosing his words with terrifying precision. "They did not just steal the $2.5 million. Using your stolen power of attorney, they just completely leveraged the entirety of your downtown commercial real estate portfolio for a massive $10 million cash loan." The heavy silence in my soundproof study was suddenly broken by the bright, cheerful ringing of my cellular phone. The screen illuminated the dark, polished wood of my desk. An incoming video call. The caller identification displayed my son. Nathaniel paused his rapid typing on the encrypted laptop and looked up at me, his sharp eyes narrowing into a look of absolute silent warning. We had just uncovered the $10 million fraudulent commercial loan. The raw, bleeding wound of their ultimate betrayal was completely fresh, burning with a cold and volatile intensity. Yet, right at this exact moment, they were calling to play their part in the grand theatrical illusion they had so meticulously crafted. I did not answer immediately. I took 3 long, deliberate breaths, forcing my racing heart into a slow, measured rhythm. I had spent 30 years breaking ruthless corporate predators. I knew exactly how to conceal my true intentions behind a perfectly blank expression. But this was not a business rival. This was my own flesh and blood. I reached out and gently dimmed the small brass desk lamp, casting my face into deep, forgiving shadows. I intentionally slouched my shoulders forward, letting my posture collapse into the fragile, defeated shape of a broken old man. I softened my jaw, allowed my eyes to glaze over with a manufactured hazy confusion, and finally pressed the green button to accept the video connection. The high-definition screen flickered instantly, displaying the incredibly bright, smiling faces of Preston and Corinne. "Hey, Dad," Preston said cheerfully, his voice ringing with a false, manufactured enthusiasm that made my stomach churn. "We just wanted to call and check in on you. We are getting settled into the new place." I stared at the digital image of my only son. I searched his familiar features for any microscopic trace of guilt, any subtle indication of the massive financial crimes he had just committed against me. There was absolutely nothing. His eyes were clear and completely void of remorse. Behind them, I noticed the background was tightly framed. They were positioned against a very plain, unassuming beige wall with a single cheap-looking framed print of a desert landscape. It was a highly calculated camera angle, intentionally designed to completely hide the sweeping, luxurious grandeur of the multi-million-dollar Arizona estate my stolen money had just purchased. "It is just a very modest rental, Everett," Corinne chimed in, her voice dripping with that same artificial syrupy concern she had used when handing me the black market sedatives. "It is nothing fancy at all, but it is safe and comfortable for the baby while we figure things out down here. How are you feeling today? Did you remember to eat breakfast?" The sheer, unadulterated audacity of her question almost broke my carefully constructed facade. She was checking to see if the severe cognitive fog from her toxic chemical regimen was still holding me captive. She was actively probing my mental defenses, looking for any sign of clarity or resistance. I let my mouth hang open slightly. I blinked several times in rapid, exaggerated succession, perfectly mimicking the profound disorientation I had genuinely felt just a few short weeks ago under her toxic care. I think so," I mumbled deliberately, slurring my words, letting my voice trail off into a weak, uncertain whisper. I am very tired today. The house feels so incredibly big and empty without you both here." "Oh, we miss you too, Dad," Preston replied smoothly, his tone heavily layered with a thick, condescending pity. "We will come up and visit as soon as we can. You just focus on resting. You need to keep your stress levels completely down." I leaned closer to the camera lens, widening my eyes to portray a deep, helpless panic. I let my hand tremble visibly as I reached up to rub my forehead. "Preston, I cannot find my checkbook," I stammered, my voice cracking perfectly on the last syllable. "I have looked absolutely everywhere for it. Did I leave it in the kitchen before you left? I need to pay the utility bills, but my mind is it is completely blank today." I cannot remember where I put anything. I watched the high-definition screen with the predatory focus of a hawk. For one fleeting microscopic second, the polished mask slipped. Corinne subtly turned her head toward Preston. A sharp, triumphant smirk briefly flashed across her lips, a look of pure, unadulterated victory. She actually believed her chemical lobotomy had permanently destroyed my mental faculties. She believed I was sitting alone in Cleveland, completely helpless, blindly searching for a useless paper checkbook, while they were actively draining $10 million from my commercial real estate portfolio. Preston quickly masked his own smug satisfaction with a deeply patronizing smile. "Dad, please do not worry about the bills," he said, speaking to me as if I were a confused toddler. "I told you before we left, I have everything completely handled. I set up the automatic payments for you, so you do not have to stress your brain over the complex finances anymore. You just need to relax and let us take care of the heavy lifting." "You are such a good boy, Preston," I whispered, forcing a fragile, grateful smile onto my lips, while a silent, raging inferno burned behind my eyes. "I just get so terribly confused lately." "It is okay, Everett," Corinne purred softly. "We are handling the transition. Preston actually has to run out right now for a boring introductory networking seminar for local logistics managers. We are trying to build from the ground up down here." "That is right," Preston added quickly, adjusting his crisp collar. "Just pressing the flesh, trying to find some basic consulting work to keep the lights on in this little rental. We will call you tomorrow." "Okay. Get some rest, Dad." "I will," I muttered softly. "Good luck with your seminar, son." The screen went black as they abruptly terminated the connection. I immediately dropped the frail, confused posture. My spine straightened, my jaw clenched tight. I turned back to Nathaniel, who was watching me with a look of profound, silent respect. We had just witnessed the absolute depth of their depravity in real time. Right at that exact moment, the secondary, highly encrypted cellular phone, sitting flat on my mahogany desk, vibrated with a sharp, singular pulse. It was a secure, direct message from Silas, the elite private investigator I had emergency dispatched to Phoenix. I picked up the heavy device and opened the encrypted application. Silas did not send a text message. He simply sent a single high-resolution digital photograph. The timestamp in the lower right corner indicated the image had been captured less than 3 minutes ago. I stared at the bright photograph, my breathing slowing to an absolute deadly halt. Preston was not attending a boring networking seminar. The crisp photograph showed him sitting inside the private dining room of an astronomically expensive luxury steakhouse in downtown Phoenix. Preston was smiling broadly, leaning forward in deep conversation. Sitting directly across the table from my son, returning the exact same predatory smile, was the founding chief executive officer of my absolute biggest, most vicious corporate rival. My own son was actively using my heavily stolen money to orchestrate a devastating hostile buyout of my own competitor. I set the heavy cellular phone down on my desk. The quiet time for patient observation was now officially over. I immediately locked the bright glass screen of my secondary phone and turned my undivided attention back to the heavily encrypted laptop resting on the center of my desk. Nathaniel had been watching me intently from the opposite side of the room, his sharp eyes quickly catching the subtle, dangerous shift in my rigid posture. I did not need to speak a single word. I simply turned the screen of my cellular device toward him, allowing him to see the high-resolution photograph Silas had just transmitted. Nathaniel stared at the image of my son, sitting across from the chief executive officer of Vertex Global, the single most aggressive corporate rival I had battled for the better part of a decade. The color drained from Nathaniel's face for the second time that night. Vertex Global had spent years attempting to orchestrate hostile takeovers of my logistics networks, and I had personally blocked every single one of their malicious maneuvers. Now my own flesh and blood was sitting at a table with the enemy, sharing a celebratory dinner financed entirely by my stolen capital. I instructed Nathaniel to remain completely silent, while I established a secure, encrypted voice connection directly to Silas. The private investigator answered on the very first ring, his voice low and intensely focused. I told him to completely abandon his physical surveillance of the steakhouse and dedicate every single ounce of his vast digital resources to tracing the exact flow of the $10 million loan my son had fraudulently extracted from my commercial real estate portfolio. I needed to know exactly where that massive sum of money was currently sitting, and I needed to understand the precise mechanics of the financial weapon Preston was actively constructing against me. Silas did not ask any unnecessary questions or demand further explanations for my sudden urgency. He was a highly skilled man who operated exclusively in the dark, complex digital underbelly of the global financial world, tracing hidden assets and exposing complex corporate shell games for high-net-worth clients. I sat quietly in my soundproof study with Nathaniel for 3 long, agonizing hours, drinking black coffee and listening to the rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner. Just before dawn, the encrypted laptop chimed softly with an incoming data packet from Silas. He had successfully bypassed the initial banking firewalls and traced the heavily obfuscated wire transfers through a complex maze of temporary holding accounts. The $10 million had ultimately settled into a primary operational account, registered to a newly formed, privately held corporation in Arizona. The entity was named Copper State Logistics. My chest tightened painfully as I read the corporate incorporation documents Silas had managed to secure. Preston was listed as the primary founder and chief executive officer of Copper State Logistics. He was not just stealing my money to live a lavish lifestyle in Phoenix. He was using the massive capital he had fraudulently extracted from my properties to launch a direct, heavily funded competitor to my own life work. But the sheer depravity of his plan went significantly deeper than launching a simple startup. Silas had uncovered a highly confidential pending acquisition contract buried in the digital files of the newly formed corporation. Preston was not planning to build a company from the ground up. He was using the $10 million to execute a massive leveraged buyout of a critical regional subsidiary owned entirely by Vertex Global. By purchasing this specific subsidiary, Preston was effectively acquiring a massive, highly profitable, ready-made logistics infrastructure positioned directly in the heart of my most profitable southern territories. He was actively coordinating directly with my greatest corporate rival, using my own stolen money to systematically and ruthlessly dismantle my entire empire from the outside in. He intended to cannibalize my long-standing client contracts, undercut my established shipping routes, and bleed my company dry until there was absolutely nothing left but a hollow, bankrupt shell. It was a perfectly executed strategy of total financial annihilation, designed by a son who knew every single vulnerability of his father's business, because I had personally spent years teaching him how everything worked. I stared at the acquisition documents, feeling a profound, sickening wave of betrayal wash over my entire being. My own son was a treacherous corporate predator, of the absolute worst and most dangerous kind. But even as the financial reality of his treason settled over me, Silas initiated a secondary, far more invasive digital protocol. He informed me over the secure connection that he was no longer just looking at public corporate filings and hidden bank accounts. He had quietly deployed a sophisticated intrusion script designed to infiltrate Corinne's personal digital footprint. Given that she was the primary legal holder of the sprawling Phoenix mansion, Silas strongly suspected she was handling the more sensitive logistical aspects of their cross-country conspiracy. I watched the glowing screen closely as Silas's proprietary software systematically bypassed the generic consumer-grade security protocols protecting Corinne's private email servers. She had foolishly used the exact same weak, easily predictable passwords she had always utilized, completely unaware of the digital vulnerabilities she was leaving wide open. Within minutes, Silas had secured absolute unrestricted access to her entire inbox, outbox, and hidden archive folders. I instructed him to search for any correspondence dated within the last 48 hours, specifically targeting any messages containing my name or any references to the state of Ohio. The search algorithm churned for several tense seconds before returning a single highly alarming result. It was not a sent message, nor was it an incoming communication. It was a deeply buried draft email, saved meticulously in a hidden folder, waiting for final approval before being dispatched. The recipient address belonged to a prominent, highly connected county judge, presiding over the family court division in Phoenix, Arizona. My tired hands began to tremble slightly as I leaned much closer to the bright, glowing monitor. I slowly opened the unread draft email, the harsh light perfectly illuminating the absolute darkest, most sinister corners of their malicious conspiracy. The message contained a detailed, highly clinical narrative, carefully outlining my supposed rapid cognitive deterioration. It falsely claimed that I was completely unmanageable, profoundly confused, and posing an immediate severe physical danger to myself. It referenced the fabricated medical records Preston had unlawfully transferred, and it heavily relied upon the heavily edited, out-of-context videos Corinne had secretly recorded of my chemically induced lethargy. They were actively establishing a false, legally binding narrative of severe dementia. But the absolute horror of their plan did not fully crystallize in my mind until my eyes finally drifted upward to read the specific subject line Corinne had so carefully typed out. I stared at those terrifying words, the icy realization freezing the blood in my veins. The chilling subject line read, "Emergency Guardianship Petition. Everett Calder completely incapacitated." They were not just simply attempting to completely steal my money and destroy my corporate legacy. They were actively moving to legally declare me incompetent, permanently strip away all my fundamental human rights, and physically bury me alive in a locked psychiatric ward forever. The heavy silence in the room was shattered by Nathaniel slamming his hand down on the mahogany desk. I had never seen my stoic attorney lose his composure, but the sheer reality of the drafted email we had just intercepted pushed his professional boundaries. Nathaniel began to rapidly explain the brutal, utterly merciless reality of Arizona interstate guardianship laws. It was a terrifying legal loophole that Preston and Corinne were deliberately exploiting with surgical precision. Nathaniel laid out the exact sequence of events they had engineered. If Preston successfully submitted that drafted petition to the Maricopa County judge, accompanied by a fraudulently signed doctor's note from his paid clinic claiming I was a severe, immediate physical danger to myself and others, it would trigger a massive cross-state jurisdiction protocol. The Arizona court would issue an emergency medical extraction order. Arizona law enforcement would legally coordinate with the Cleveland Police Department to cross state lines, breach my front door, and forcibly seize me from my own home. I would not be given a chance to speak to an attorney. I would not be given a chance to prove my sanity. I would be immediately transported under armed guard to a highly restricted state-mandated psychiatric facility in Arizona. Once the massive steel doors locked behind me, Preston would instantly be granted complete unchecked 100% legal conservatorship over every single bank account, physical property, and corporate asset I had spent my entire life building. I would legally cease to exist as an autonomous human being. The sheer suffocating horror of their elaborate trap washed over me, cold and paralyzing. They were not merely attempting to bleed my finances dry or casually usurp my position within the company. They were deliberately orchestrating my total erasure from society. They wanted me trapped in a heavily medicated, sterile nightmare, staring blankly at a white hospital wall, while they lived like absolute royalty on the fruits of my lifelong labor. I looked at Nathaniel. His jaw was clenched so tightly, the muscles jumped beneath his pale skin. He immediately reached for his encrypted phone, stating he needed to contact the Federal Bureau of Investigation right this second. He passionately argued that we had more than enough concrete digital evidence to have Preston and Corinne arrested for massive wire fraud, grand larceny, and the malicious forging of a medical power of attorney. He wanted to freeze their bank accounts, lock down the commercial real estate properties, and effectively tie them up in federal court for the next decade. I slowly raised my hand, palm facing outward, instantly stopping his frantic movements. I absolutely did not want the federal authorities involved. I did not want a long, highly publicized, drawn-out legal battle where Preston could hire expensive defense attorneys, play the desperate, misunderstood son, and drag my family name through the sensationalized public mud. Calling the police for a simple fraud charge felt like an absolute insult to the tremendous magnitude of his betrayal. Simple fraud was a manageable corporate risk. What my son had done was a highly calculated act of profound, unforgivable warfare. I did not want him merely arrested. I wanted absolute catastrophic annihilation. I wanted to thoroughly dismantle his entire existence on the exact same ruthless battlefield he had so arrogantly chosen to fight me on. I fully intended to make him watch his stolen empire turn to worthless ash in his trembling hands long before he ever saw the inside of a concrete prison cell. I deliberately turned my undivided attention back to the secure voice connection with Silas, who was still actively monitoring Corinne's digital footprint from the digital shadows. I strictly instructed the elite private investigator to immediately halt any further defensive maneuvers. We were shifting gears and going strictly on the aggressive offensive. I ordered Silas to contact my private aviation crew and thoroughly prep my Gulfstream jet for an immediate, completely unlogged departure. We were flying directly into the vulnerable heart of their criminal operation. We were going to Phoenix, Arizona. I firmly told Silas to assemble a highly specialized tactical team on the ground before my plane ever touched the tarmac. I desperately needed his absolute best forensic accountants, elite shadow lawyers who expertly operated outside the standard ethical boundaries, and a heavily armed physical security detail. I was going to systematically dismantle Copper State Logistics, violently rip the $10 million loan right out of their treacherous hands, and completely sever their corporate connection to my biggest rival before Preston even realized he was under heavy attack. I was going to be a total ghost, moving silently through his newly purchased mansion and his stolen corporate infrastructure, methodically destroying every single supportive pillar of his fraudulent life. Nathaniel stared at me, his eyes extremely wide, with a potent mixture of profound shock and deep, unwavering professional respect. He slowly lowered his phone, finally realizing that the man sitting across from him was no longer just a deeply concerned father dealing with a rebellious child. I was a veteran corporate titan, fiercely preparing to go to absolute war, and I was going to expertly execute my incredibly treacherous son with the exact same cold, highly calculated brutality he had foolishly shown me. I instructed Nathaniel to begin drafting the emergency legal countermeasures we would actively need to strike back at the massive commercial loan. Preparing a massive, completely silent financial ambush that would securely freeze the $10 million, the exact second Preston boldly attempted to formally finalize his leveraged buyout of the rival subsidiary. We were going to brutally cut his financial throat right at the closing table. As Nathaniel began furiously typing on his encrypted laptop, meticulously formulating the incredibly complex legal traps we would confidently spring in Arizona, the secure phone on my desk vibrated with an incredibly sharp, undeniably urgent tone. It was another direct communication from Silas. His voice, transmitting through the heavily encrypted speaker, was unbelievably tense, entirely lacking its usual calm, highly collected professional cadence. While he had been actively monitoring the hidden digital back channels of the Maricopa County Judicial Network, a sudden, deeply alarming update had just flashed across the highly restricted internal dockets. Silas had incredibly successfully intercepted a highly classified, tightly sealed court filing, originating directly from the specific family court judge Corinne had previously emailed. The judge had officially received their entirely fabricated, incredibly malicious emergency guardianship petition, based entirely on the completely fraudulent doctor's note, the heavily manipulated video footage of my chemically induced lethargy, and Preston's utterly fabricated legal testimony regarding my supposed complete mental collapse. The Arizona court had moved with terrifying, absolutely unprecedented legal speed. The judge approved the preliminary medical evaluation. The horrifying reality of their accelerated operational timeline suddenly slammed into me with the devastating force of a derailed freight train. Silas rapidly read the final encrypted lines of the intercepted judicial order, his tense voice dropping to a grim, absolute whisper. The binding warrant for my immediate, highly involuntary medical extraction had just been signed and stamped by the state magistrate. State troopers were scheduled to raid my Cleveland home in exactly 48 hours. I did not waste a single second, succumbing to the terror my son had orchestrated. The clock in my private study sounded like a deafening hammer, beating against the fragile remnants of my former life. I looked at Nathaniel and told him to file every legal injunction to stall the Cleveland police, explicitly instructing him to use my genuine medical records to build an impenetrable wall around my physical estate. I grabbed my coat, walked out the front door, and climbed into the waiting town car Silas had already dispatched to my driveway. The drive to the airfield was a silent blur of passing streetlights and cold calculation. When I stepped onto the tarmac, the engines of my Gulfstream jet were screaming with immense power. Silas stood near the boarding stairs holding a tactical briefcase, his face an unreadable mask of pure professional focus. We boarded the aircraft, and the door sealed shut behind us. As the jet tore through the night sky toward Arizona, I sat in the luxurious cabin and reviewed the digital dossier Silas compiled on the flight. We were completely off the radar, flying under an obscured tail number that Preston could never trace back to my primary holding company. My son believed I was sitting helplessly in my study, completely sedated, and waiting for the authorities to violently kick down my door. He had absolutely no idea I was rocketing toward his new sanctuary at 500 miles per hour, armed with the financial ammunition required to destroy his entire world. We touched down at a discreet private executive terminal on the outskirts of Phoenix, just before dawn. The dry Arizona air hit my face as I descended the metal steps, bringing with it the harsh reality of the battlefield I was now standing on. A heavily tinted armored sport utility vehicle was already idling on the concrete runway, arranged seamlessly by Silas's security contacts. We climbed into the back seat and merged onto the highway system as the morning sun began to bleed over the distant horizon. Silas displayed the GPS coordinates for the multi-million-dollar mansion Corinne had purchased under her corporate shell. It was located in an exclusive, heavily guarded neighborhood just 15 miles away. "We are not going to the house," I stated firmly, my voice cutting through the quiet hum of the vehicle tires. "Preston and Corinne are simply the vicious symptoms of this legal infection. We need to completely eradicate the actual disease, giving their fabricated story oxygen." I instructed the driver to bypass their luxurious neighborhood entirely and head straight toward the prestigious medical district in the center of the city. We were going directly to the sprawling, high-end private medical clinic operated by Dr. Halloran. Dr. Halloran was the highly esteemed, expensive Arizona physician who had formally signed my fraudulent dementia diagnosis and confidently submitted the emergency guardianship petition to the local magistrate. I had initially assumed my son simply paid a corrupt doctor, a standard cash bribe, to falsify a few medical forms. However, the sheer speed and absolute legal weight of the court filing indicated a much deeper, far more insidious level of professional cooperation. This doctor was risking his entire medical license and his lucrative career to legally bury me alive. I needed to know exactly why he was willing to cross such a perilous line for a man he had only known for 3 short months. The driver smoothly pulled the heavy vehicle into the pristine manicured parking lot of the sprawling medical complex. It was an imposing structure, composed entirely of reflective blue glass and polished white steel, radiating an aura of absolute wealth and exclusive medical privilege. We parked the dark vehicle in a secluded corner space, heavily shaded by a row of tall oak trees, completely out of sight from the main glass entrance. Silas did not even bother reaching for the heavy door handle. He simply opened his tactical briefcase, resting on the leather seat, and pulled out a specialized military-grade digital decryption laptop. He deployed a small, high-gain directional antenna and pointed it directly at the second-floor windows of the prominent medical building. I watched in absolute silence as Silas expertly initiated a highly aggressive, sophisticated network cloning protocol. He was actively spoofing the primary wireless access point of the clinic, creating an invisible identical digital twin right inside our parked vehicle. Within 4 short minutes, a careless administrative assistant, sitting somewhere inside the glass building, mindlessly connected her mobile device to Silas's fraudulent network. That singular innocent mistake gave him instant unrestricted access to the entire internal server architecture of the exclusive medical facility. He rapidly bypassed the secondary patient privacy firewalls and burrowed deep into the encrypted administrative directories. Lines of complex code cascaded rapidly down his dark monitor as he methodically searched the primary database for my specific name and birth date. He found the highly sensitive file almost immediately. Silas aggressively downloaded the entire folder, pulling the highly classified documents directly from the secure servers of Dr. Halloran and transferring them onto his encrypted hard drive. He opened the digital files, and the sickening reality of the medical conspiracy finally materialized right before my eyes. The assessments were incredibly detailed, remarkably thorough, and entirely fabricated from thin air. Dr. Halloran had meticulously documented 3 entirely fictional, in-person consultations with me. He wrote elaborate clinical notes describing my supposed aggressive outbursts, my profound memory lapses, and my total inability to perform basic daily human functions. He even included falsified blood panel results that conveniently supported the exact neurosuppressants Corinne had been secretly crushing into my food. It was a flawless, legally unassailable medical execution. But Silas was not satisfied with finding the fraudulent patient assessments. He dug deeper, shifting his digital focus onto the personal financial records of the corrupt doctor himself. If a highly respected professional was willing to commit such a severe crime, there had to be a massive motivation beneath the surface. Silas accessed the shielded correspondence files stored on the local server. He cross-referenced the private banking applications Dr. Halloran had accessed using the clinic network. The devastating truth unraveled with astonishing speed. Dr. Halloran was not a successful professional. He was a desperate, drowning man. The banking logs revealed a crippling addiction to high-stakes, unregulated international sports betting. The prestigious doctor was suffocating under a mountain of catastrophic illegal gambling debts. His primary medical practice was severely mortgaged. His personal assets were completely depleted, and he was violently bleeding cash to dangerous people who did not respect the standard legal boundaries of debt collection. Silas opened a deeply buried offshore transaction ledger, his eyes narrowing sharply at the digital numbers glowing on the screen. He turned the laptop toward me, pointing directly at a highly secured wire transfer executed exactly 7 days ago. Corinne had not just paid the doctor a consulting fee. Using the massive commercial loan they had fraudulently stolen from my real estate portfolio, she had deliberately wired exactly $150,000 directly into an untraceable account, owned explicitly by the doctor's personal dangerous bookie. I stared at the glowing digits on Silas's encrypted screen, memorizing the routing numbers linking my stolen commercial equity to the illegal gambling debts of a desperate physician. We had the smoking gun. Silas packed up the mobile cloning station. We were going to cut the head off this particular snake right now. Silas bypassed the electronic security gate at the rear of the private clinic. The sprawling modern glass building was completely dark, save for a single illuminated window on the 2nd floor. Dr. Halloran was still inside. We slipped through the staff entrance with practiced silence. Silas expertly neutralized the internal alarms using his specialized bypass token, allowing us to move like absolute ghosts through the sterile corridors. The air smelled of sharp antiseptic. We approached the heavy mahogany door of the executive medical suite. I did not knock. I simply turned the polished brass handle and walked inside, completely unannounced. Dr. Halloran was sitting behind his massive desk, his face buried in his trembling hands, a glass of amber liquor resting on top of scattered files. He violently jerked his head upward at the sudden intrusion. For a fleeting second, his tired eyes registered pure, unadulterated terror. When his panicked gaze finally recognized my face, the absolute shock completely drained the remaining color from his skin. I did not shout. I did not raise my voice or display the raging inferno burning within my chest. I walked forward with slow, incredibly measured steps and stopped directly in front of his polished desk. I calmly reached inside my tailored coat pocket and withdrew a thick manila folder. I tossed it onto the center of the desk. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud. I quietly instructed him to open it immediately. Dr. Halloran reached forward, with hands that shook so violently he could barely grasp the cardboard cover. He slowly flipped the folder open. Staring back at him were crisp printouts of the offshore wire transfers Corinne had executed precisely 7 days ago. Right below those damning financial records sat perfectly cloned copies of the fabricated cognitive assessments he had formally submitted to the Maricopa County Court. The concrete proof of his catastrophic medical fraud was laid bare under the glaring halogen lamp. A cold bead of sweat traced its way down his pale temple. "You are a man of science, doctor," I said, my voice completely devoid of any warmth, a sharp whisper cutting through the oppressive silence. "Let us look at the empirical data currently sitting on your desk. You have actively conspired to commit massive interstate wire fraud. You have knowingly falsified binding legal medical documents. You have accepted $150,000 in stolen money from my commercial portfolio. You have maliciously weaponized the Arizona judicial system against a healthy citizen. You have done all of this to pay off highly illegal international gambling debts." I paused, letting the devastating weight of those federal crimes settle onto his trembling shoulders. "The penalties for these specific infractions will guarantee you spend the rest of your natural life rotting inside a federal penitentiary." Dr. Halloran tried to speak, but his throat was completely dry. He choked on his own breath, a pathetic whimpering sound escaping his lips. He looked from the damning papers to my face, silently begging for a mercy he absolutely did not deserve. I leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the edge of his desk, invading his physical space with unwavering dominance. "I am not here to negotiate with you," I stated coldly. "I am here to offer you a singular alternative to absolute destruction." Silas stepped forward from the shadows of the doorway, extracting a blank sworn affidavit alongside a heavy silver fountain pen. He placed the items directly on top of the forged medical records. "You are going to write a detailed, comprehensive confession," I instructed. "You will legally invalidate the emergency guardianship petition you submitted." He stared at the blank affidavit, his body convulsing with sheer panic. "If I sign this," he stammered, his voice weak and entirely broken, "I am admitting to medical malpractice. They will ruin my career. I will lose absolutely everything." I stared down at him with cold, unrelenting disgust. "Your career is already over, doctor. You traded your medical oath for dirty money. You are no longer choosing between your career and your reputation. You are choosing between a quiet resignation and dying in a federal prison cell. If you do not sign that paper right this very second, I will immediately forward this entire folder to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You will be arrested before the sun comes up. Pick up the pen." Dr. Halloran let out a long, shuddering sob. He slowly picked up the silver pen, his hand shaking so badly he could barely form the letters. For the next 20 minutes, the only sound in the room was the frantic scratching of ink against heavy paper. He poured out every single detail of the malicious conspiracy. He documented Corinne's initial phone calls, Preston's aggressive demands, and the exact amount of the bribes they had promised him in exchange for my permanent medical incarceration. When he finally finished, he signed his full legal name at the bottom of the page and pushed the document back across the desk. Silas immediately took the paper, officially notarized the signature with a specialized field stamp, and securely packed the devastating confession away. We possessed the absolute legal power to instantly nullify the impending police raid. I turned away from the broken physician, utterly disgusted by his profound cowardice. I had everything I needed to protect my physical freedom. Silas and I moved toward the door, preparing to launch the next phase of our aggressive counterattack. But just as my hand grasped the brass handle, Dr. Halloran called out from the heavy shadows of his desk. His voice was a frantic, desperate whisper. "Everett, wait," he pleaded. There is something else, something you urgently need to know about their timeline. I stopped and turned around, narrowing my eyes at the trembling man. They are not waiting for the state troopers to bring you down here, he confessed rapidly. They are moving the financial acquisition forward right now. They are officially closing the $10 million hostile buyout deal tomorrow night. They are throwing a massive gala at their new mansion. I stared at the pathetic, ruined doctor, feeling a new, incredibly sharp wave of absolute clarity wash over my entire mind. Preston was not just stealing my legacy in the dark. He was throwing a lavish, arrogant party to celebrate my destruction, right in front of the very enemies I had spent a lifetime fighting. He was completely convinced that I was drugged, defeated, and mere hours away from being locked inside a psychiatric ward forever. He felt absolutely untouchable. I did not say a single word to the doctor. I simply walked out into the cool Arizona night. The battlefield was perfectly set. The trap was fully armed. Tomorrow night, my treacherous son was going to learn exactly what happens when you confidently invite a ghost to your own victory celebration. The battlefield was perfectly set. The trap was fully armed. Tomorrow night, my treacherous son was going to learn exactly what happens when you confidently invite a ghost to your own victory celebration. I walked back to the armored vehicle where Silas was stowing his hardware. We drove away from the clinic in total silence, the neon lights of Phoenix blurring past the tinted windows. My mind was laser-focused on the mechanical execution of his impending destruction. We arrived at a secure executive suite Silas had booked to ensure anonymity. Nathaniel Rourke was waiting, pacing the hardwood floor with his phone pressed to his ear. When he saw me walk through the mahogany doors, he ended his call and gestured toward the dining table, which was covered in printed financial schematics. "Everett, we have a critical vulnerability," Nathaniel stated, his voice tight with professional anxiety. "I have mapped the routing structure of the $10 million loan. Preston pledged your most lucrative Cleveland towers as collateral. He used the forged medical power of attorney to authorize the transfer of the capital into the operational accounts of Copper State Logistics. Tomorrow night at this lavish gala, he is scheduled to formally sign the final acquisition paperwork with Vertex Global. Once that signature is inked and the massive wire transfer initiates, recovering that capital will require months of brutal federal litigation." I poured myself a glass of cold water, took a measured sip, and set the glass down. "You are only looking at the superficial architecture of my portfolio, Nathaniel," I replied smoothly, projecting unshakable calm. "You are analyzing the specific corporate structure I intentionally left completely visible for anyone who came aggressively looking for a glaring weakness. But you do not successfully build a billion-dollar logistics empire without engineering a catastrophic fail-safe mechanism." Nathaniel frowned deeply, his analytical legal mind rapidly processing my statement. "What exactly are you saying, Everett? The commercial property deeds are completely public record. The loans are currently actively registered. 3 years ago," I began, my voice deliberately dropping into a low, menacing cadence, "when I officially stepped back from the daily operational management of the logistics company to let Preston take on a more prominent leadership role, I did not just passively leave my primary liquid wealth sitting vulnerable in standard domestic financial holding accounts. I anticipated that entrusting such massive, unchecked operational power to an ambitious executive required an equally massive, totally invisible safety net. I liquidated a significant portion of my secondary assets and quietly moved all my core equity into a highly fortified sovereign financial fortress. I established a specialized Swiss blind trust, Nathaniel's eyes widened slightly in genuine surprise. He was intimately familiar with high-level wealth management, but he had never been granted any access to this specific, deeply buried tier of my personal finances. That particular trust, I continued, pacing across the thick carpet, was meticulously designed to be legally impenetrable. It is hosted on offline servers buried deeply inside a repurposed military bunker in the freezing Swiss Alps. But its true devastating power actually lies within its aggressive defensive architecture. I explicitly instructed the international trustees to seamlessly integrate a lethal, highly automated digital snare into the foundational code. I personally call it the poison pill clause. Silas looked up from his tactical laptop, his interest visibly piqued by the complex security protocol I was outlining. Preston currently believes that possessing my forged signature and the completely fraudulent medical power of attorney magically grants him absolute unchecked sovereignty over my financial existence, I explained vividly, picturing my son's arrogant smirk. He foolishly assumed that simply flashing a notarized piece of paper at a standard domestic commercial bank would instantly unlock the legendary vaults. And for the initial $10 million margin loan, it temporarily did exactly that. Domestic institutions are notoriously lazy when presented with seemingly legitimate legal forms. But that specific $10 million is currently trapped in a deeply monitored escrow holding account. In order to release those funds and execute the final wire transfer to Vertex Global, the primary account holder must provide definitive overriding authorization. I stopped pacing and looked directly into Nathaniel's eyes. The poison pill clause strictly dictates that any major highly irregular capital withdrawal exceeding exactly $1 million cannot possibly be authorized by a standard signature, a digital passcode, or any piece of written legal documentation. It fundamentally requires my live, physical biometric scan, a live, heavily encrypted retinal verification, flawlessly combined with a dynamic vocal passphrase that only I possess. Nathaniel's mouth parted slightly as the sheer, unadulterated brilliance of the trap finally dawned on him. "Preston has absolutely no idea," he whispered, staring blankly at the complex financial schematics resting on the table. "None whatsoever," I confirmed coldly. "He arrogantly thinks his forged medical documents effortlessly override absolutely everything. He genuinely believes he has successfully bypassed all my legendary security measures simply because I quietly allowed him to navigate the fragile decoy perimeter. Tomorrow night, he is going to stand proudly in front of his wealthy new friends, his corrupt medical accomplices, and the chief executive officer of our absolute biggest corporate rival. He is going to confidently sign a legally binding commercial acquisition contract, publicly committing himself to purchasing a massive subsidiary for $10 million. I leaned heavily over the dining table, my hands resting flat against the cool, polished wood. And when he inevitably attempts to initiate the final mandatory wire transfer to complete the transaction, the Swiss servers will aggressively demand a live biometric authentication. Preston will obviously fail. The system will immediately reject the fraudulent transfer. But it does not just quietly decline the transaction. The poison pill protocol automatically triggers a catastrophic, completely irrevocable digital alarm. It instantly flags the unauthorized transfer attempt as a massive deliberate act of federal wire fraud and international money laundering. It simultaneously dispatches a comprehensive, heavily encrypted data packet containing all the fraudulent transaction logs, the forged power of attorney, and the specific IP addresses of the origin computers, directly to the Cybercrime Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Department of the Treasury, and Interpol. Nathaniel swallowed hard, his protective professional instincts warring with the breathtaking ruthlessness of the strategy. He looked at the wall clock, then quickly back at me. "Everett, if we allow him to proceed, the legal fallout will be astronomical. We have the absolute proof of the forged medical documents right now. We physically possess the offshore wire transfers, proving the blatant bribery. We can legally freeze the commercial escrow accounts right now and permanently lock down the $10 million before the gala even begins. We can completely save your capital without triggering the massive international wire fraud tripwires." I stared intently at my longtime attorney across the room. He was an incredibly smart man, but he was still thinking exactly like a conventional risk-averse lawyer. He simply did not fully comprehend the deeply personal nature of this war. "No," I replied coldly, staring directly at the bright glowing screen. "Let them confidently sign the buyout contract first. Let them fully commit the felony on paper." The following evening descended upon the Sonoran foothills with a stifling dry heat. We sat parked in absolute darkness, completely concealed inside a heavily modified, blacked-out surveillance van, situated exactly directly across the street from the sprawling perimeter of Sable Ridge Holdings. The magnificent estate Corinne had so casually dismissed as a modest rental was a breathtaking multi-million-dollar architectural marvel of sheer arrogance. It sat behind massive wrought iron gates, boasting expansive manicured lawns, a sweeping circular driveway, and enormous floor-to-ceiling glass windows that radiated brilliant warm light into the darkening evening. The property was a physical manifestation of my stolen legacy, purchased with cash that I had bled for over 3 decades. Tonight, that stolen mansion was hosting a celebration of my impending destruction. A steady, luxurious procession of high-end vehicles flowed through the open security gates. Valets in crisp white shirts rushed to park sleek sports cars and heavy luxury sedans. Preston and Corinne had absolutely wasted no time integrating themselves into the wealthy upper echelon of the local elite. They were hosting a lavish, catered gala, sparing absolutely no expense to project the ultimate image of untouchable corporate power. I watched through the dark-tinted surveillance window as waitstaff carried silver trays of expensive champagne and delicate appetizers among the elegantly dressed guests lingering on the expansive outdoor terraces. My son was playing the role of the self-made corporate titan, completely financed by a profound chemical betrayal. Silas sat beside me in the cramped darkness of the van, surrounded by a glowing wall of highly specialized tactical monitors. He was not looking at the visual feed. He was actively preparing to capture the invisible audio. He carefully mounted a highly sensitive military-grade laser microphone onto a stabilized tripod, pointing the invisible beam directly at the massive glass panes of the primary formal dining room. The sophisticated technology worked by reading the microscopic vibrations on the surface of the glass caused by the human voices speaking inside the room, translating those invisible tremors back into crystal-clear digital audio. Silas expertly adjusted a series of complex frequency dials, filtering out the ambient background noise of the clinking silverware, the soft jazz playing through the external speakers, and the general hum of the crowded party. Within seconds, the isolated audio feed crackled to life inside our soundproof van. The voices of my enemies flooded into the dark space with terrifying, absolute clarity. I heard Corinne laughing, a bright, sparkling sound that completely turned my stomach. She was holding court near the grand entryway, charming a group of local investors with a completely fabricated story about our family dynamic. "We just decided we needed a massive change of pace," Corinne purred smoothly, to a wealthy-looking woman dripping in diamonds. Cleveland was simply becoming too chaotic, and Everett, well, Preston's father has unfortunately taken a very sudden, very severe turn for the worse, health-wise. We had to step in and assume total control of his affairs. It has been incredibly difficult, but Preston has been so remarkably strong, taking over the heavy burden of the corporate empire. I sat in the dark van, my jaw clenched so tightly my teeth began to grind. She was laying the flawless social groundwork for my impending disappearance. She was actively building the public narrative of the tragic failing father and the heroic, capable son who was bravely stepping up to save the family legacy. It was a masterful, sickening performance, but the absolute true focus of the evening was not the local socialites. Silas tapped my shoulder and pointed directly at a secondary monitor. A long, sleek black limousine had just pulled up to the front entrance. A tall, impeccably tailored man with silver hair stepped out, accompanied by two stern-looking corporate lawyers carrying heavy leather briefcases. It was Garrett Kane, the founding chief executive officer of Vertex Global. He was the ruthless, highly predatory rival I had successfully fended off for years. Now, he was walking directly into my stolen house, graciously invited by my own treacherous son. Preston practically ran out the front door to greet him, shaking his hand with a level of frantic, eager enthusiasm that bordered on pathetic subservience. My son was desperately trying to project dominance, but he was completely out of his depth. He was swimming in shark-infested waters, utilizing a stolen life raft, absolutely convinced he was the apex predator. We listened intently as Preston proudly led Garrett Kane away from the loud, crowded party and directly into the quiet, secluded, formal dining room. The heavy wooden doors closed securely behind them, isolating the key players for the final fatal transaction. Silas immediately isolated the laser microphone onto that specific pane of glass, bringing their hushed, serious conversation into absolute perfect focus. "Thank you for flying down on such incredibly short notice, Garrett," Preston said, his voice echoing with a manufactured, forced confidence. "I wanted to ensure we finalized this monumental transition in a truly fitting, celebratory environment." Garrett Kane let out a low, deeply cynical chuckle. "I must admit, Preston, when you initially reached out with the proposal to execute a hostile, leveraged buyout of my southern subsidiary, I was profoundly skeptical. Your father has aggressively blocked my operational expansion into his primary territories for over a decade. I naturally assumed you were operating under his strict conservative directives. My father is no longer steering the corporate ship, Garrett," Preston replied, his tone chillingly cold and absolute. "He has experienced a catastrophic, completely irreversible cognitive decline. He is no longer capable of executing complex logistics. I possess the full legal power of attorney, and I am actively liquidating his stagnant commercial portfolio to heavily fund this new, highly aggressive venture. Copper State Logistics is the actual future. We are cutting out the dead weight." I sat in the absolute darkness of the surveillance van, listening to my only son, casually and mercilessly, describe my total erasure. He was selling my legacy to my absolute worst enemy for a fraction of its true worth, simply to feed his own insatiable, reckless ego. "I see," Garrett Kane murmured, the distinct sound of heavy bound leather folders being placed firmly onto the long dining table, echoing through the crisp audio feed. "Well, I have thoroughly reviewed the extensive financial disclosures and the specific letters of credit provided by your commercial lending institution. The $10 million equity is fully verified and currently waiting securely in escrow. Assuming the final capital clears my accounts by tomorrow morning, the subsidiary, its physical assets, and its entire regional infrastructure are completely yours. Silas's fingers hovered directly over his primary keyboard. He looked over at me, his eyes waiting for the final definitive command. If we executed the secondary digital block right now, we could instantly freeze the escrow accounts and completely stop the financial transfer before the pen ever touched the paper. We could completely end the hostile buyout in a single heartbeat. I slowly shook my head. I stared straight ahead at the glowing windows of the mansion. I did not want to merely stop them. I wanted them to walk completely willingly into the federal trap. I wanted the absolute, undeniable physical proof of their massive criminal intent. A sharp, clear sound pierced the digital audio feed. It was the distinct pop of a highly expensive champagne cork, followed closely by the delicate crystalline clinking of heavy glass flutes. To a profoundly lucrative partnership, Garrett Kane declared smoothly, and to the incredibly bright, highly profitable future of Copper State Logistics. To the absolute future, Preston replied, his voice practically vibrating with arrogant, blind triumph. I listened to the rustling of heavy parchment paper. I heard the sharp, definitive scratching of a fountain pen moving rapidly across the signature lines. Preston was eagerly signing his name, completely binding himself to the fraudulent contract. He was officially committing grand larceny, massive wire fraud, and severe corporate espionage in front of multiple highly credible witnesses. The scratching finally stopped. The heavy folders were decisively snapped shut. "Excellent," Garrett Kane stated, his tone shifting into absolute rigid business protocol. "The legal contracts are now fully executed. I simply need the final authorization from your lending institution to release the $10 million from the holding escrow." Preston confidently pulled his laptop closer. The sound of his fingers tapping the keys echoed in the van. It was the sound of a man blindly stepping off a massive, fatal cliff. "Consider it completely done, Garrett," Preston announced proudly, his voice carrying the ultimate catastrophic lie. "I am authorizing the final release protocol right now. The funds are being transferred as we speak." I listened to the breathtaking arrogance of his statement, hanging in the digital audio feed. Preston genuinely believed his stolen authority was absolute. I turned my attention away from the glowing surveillance monitor and slowly opened the heavy matte black casing of my encrypted tactical laptop. The screen illuminated the cramped, dark interior of the surveillance van with a cold, pale light. Silas remained completely silent beside me, his eyes locked onto the visual feeds of the dining room. I accessed the highly restricted offline communication terminal that connected directly to the subterranean servers in Switzerland. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for only a fraction of a second before I began to type. I opened a new highly secured message window directed to the primary trustee of my sovereign accounts. I carefully typed the specific subject line we had established 3 years ago for exactly this type of catastrophic scenario. It read, "Irrevocable Trust Revocation. Fraud Protocol Alpha." I did not include a greeting. I did not include a concluding signature. I simply attached the raw digital capture of his unauthorized wire transfer attempt, completely combined with his fabricated medical power of attorney, and I decisively hit the send key. The transmission took less than 4 seconds to bounce off the encrypted satellite relay and immediately strike the deeply buried European servers. What happened next was entirely automated, completely devoid of human hesitation or mercy. The poison pill protocol woke up with terrifying efficiency. Deep within the global financial network, the massive $10 million wire transfer Preston had confidently initiated toward the holding accounts slammed into an impenetrable digital wall. The escrow gateway did not just simply decline the transaction for insufficient authentication. It actively seized the funds permanently, freezing the entire account balance under a sovereign legal lock. But the defensive architecture was fundamentally designed to go much further than simple asset protection. The moment the unauthorized transfer was violently rejected, the Swiss servers aggressively launched their secondary lethal countermeasures. A massive, heavily encrypted data packet containing the forged documents, the unauthorized routing requests, and the specific IP addresses originating from the stolen mansion was automatically compiled and immediately dispatched. The algorithms simultaneously notified the Cybercrimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the enforcement arm of the Securities and Exchange Commission. My son had just permanently flagged himself and Copper State Logistics on the federal radar as active perpetrators of massive coordinated money laundering and interstate wire fraud. I watched the visual feed of the formal dining room, waiting for the devastating digital shockwave to physically reach the table. Garrett Kane was leaning back in his leather chair, a smug, deeply satisfied smile etched across his weathered face. He was casually swirling the expensive champagne in his crystal flute, completely ready to toast his ultimate victory over his oldest rival. Preston sat across from him, practically glowing with unearned stolen power. The heavy silence in the room stretched for 30 agonizing seconds as the sophisticated banking application on the laptop attempted to process the massive financial request. I could see the exact moment the fatal error code finally materialized on his glowing screen. Preston frowned deeply, a subtle, highly confused wrinkle suddenly appearing directly between his dark eyebrows. He leaned forward nervously, heavily squinting at the bright monitor, as if his own eyes were actively deceiving him. He quickly tapped the keyboard, attempting to manually refresh the secure banking portal. The system instantly responded with a flashing bright red security notification. The account was not just frozen, it was completely locked down and flagged for severe federal review. Garrett Kane noticed the sudden sharp shift in his arrogant posture. The veteran corporate predator leaned forward, his smug smile slowly fading into an expression of cold, calculating suspicion. "Is there an issue with the final clearance, Preston?" he asked, his voice entirely stripped of its former warmth. Preston swallowed hard, his throat visibly bobbing on the high-definition feed. "No, Garrett, there is absolutely no issue," he stammered nervously, a thin layer of cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. "It is simply a minor routing delay, a standard security precaution for a transfer of this immense magnitude. I will have my personal bankers authorize the manual override first thing tomorrow morning." Garrett Kane stared at him with flat, merciless eyes. "Tomorrow morning was not the agreement, Preston," he stated coldly. "You explicitly assured me the capital was fully cleared and ready for immediate deployment. I do not sign binding corporate acquisition contracts on the promise of a morning delay." Preston frantically began typing on his laptop keyboard, desperately trying to immediately access the secondary operational accounts he had previously established, using the heavily fraudulent medical power of attorney. He was blindly grasping for any financial lifeline to save the crumbling business deal. But the ruthless poison pill protocol had not merely locked down the $10 million escrow account. It had aggressively severed every single financial connection linked to the forged legal documents. The entire stolen empire was systematically shutting down, in real time, effectively leaving him entirely bankrupt. While Preston desperately tried to placate his furious rival in the isolated dining room, a completely different, deeply domestic crisis was rapidly unfolding in the grand foyer, directly amidst all of their wealthy guests. Silas shifted the primary laser microphone focus to the front of the house, capturing the chaotic audio of the massive gala. Corinne was still standing near the sweeping staircase, completely oblivious to the catastrophic financial collapse silently occurring just down the dark hallway. She was laughing loudly, clutching a half-empty glass of expensive wine, thoroughly enjoying her stolen status as an elite Arizona socialite. I watched as a man wearing a crisp black tuxedo approached her. He was the senior operational manager of the high-end catering company they had hired to service the lavish event. His face was extremely pale, his posture rigid with deep, overwhelming professional discomfort, sweating very, very profusely. The catering manager nervously cleared his dry throat, leaning in very closely to speak over the loud music and the bustling crowd. He absolutely did not want to cause a public scene, but his urgent dilemma could not possibly wait. Corinne turned toward him, her fabricated smile slipping slightly as she registered his tense demeanor. She let out a heavy, irritated sigh, clearly annoyed by the sudden interruption of her triumphant performance. "Is there a problem with the service tonight?" she demanded sharply, her voice carrying a distinct tone of absolute arrogant condescension. The manager shifted his weight, glancing nervously at the wealthy guests standing nearby. He lowered his voice to a strained, highly anxious whisper, but the sensitive tactical microphone caught every single devastating word. "Mrs. Calder, I sincerely apologize for the profound inconvenience," he whispered nervously. "We attempted to process the final pre-authorized charge for the $50,000 catering invoice. The bank did not just decline the transaction. The merchant services terminal explicitly instructed us to physically confiscate the card and contact the Federal Fraud Department immediately. Your exclusive Black American Express card has just been violently and permanently declined by the main bank." Corinne stared at the catering manager in absolute uncomprehending silence. The heavy crystal wine glass in her hand trembled slightly, the expensive red liquid sloshing against the delicate rim. She opened her mouth to aggressively reprimand the man, to loudly demand that he run the premium card again and stop embarrassing her in front of her new affluent social circle. But before a single word of her vicious, highly selfish entitlement could escape her lips, a completely different sound violently shattered the elegant ambiance of the evening. It started as a distant, high-pitched wail, echoing over the dark Sonoran foothills, rapidly multiplying and intensifying until it became a deafening, terrifying chorus. The low, rhythmic thumping of the jazz band was instantly drowned out by the aggressive, synchronized screaming of heavy law enforcement sirens. Inside the dark surveillance van, I leaned closer to the glowing tactical monitors, my breathing steady and completely controlled. The spectacular show was finally beginning. Through the highly sensitive audio feed, I could hear the collective gasp of the wealthy attendees on the terrace, as flashing red and blue lights painted the manicured trees and the sprawling front lawn in frantic strobing colors. The massive custom wrought iron gates that Preston had proudly installed to keep the real world at a distance did not gently slide open to grant them access. A heavy reinforced tactical vehicle hit the center locking mechanism at 40 miles per hour. The deafening crash of yielding metal echoed loudly through the dry night air. 4 massive, completely blacked-out sport utility vehicles, followed by a fleet of marked Arizona State Trooper cruisers, aggressively swarmed into the circular driveway. The pristine gravel crunched violently beneath heavy, aggressive tires as the federal convoy rapidly established a dominant perimeter around the stolen mansion. Dozens of highly trained, heavily armed federal agents wearing tactical vests emblazoned with the bold yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation poured out of the dark vehicles. They moved with absolute terrifying precision. They did not shout or draw their weapons, but their physical presence completely commanded the massive estate. The affluent party guests instantly froze in sheer terror. Wealthy investors and elite socialites spilled their expensive champagne onto the imported stone walkways, scrambling desperately to move out of the path of the advancing federal strike team. Corinne dropped her wineglass completely. It shattered on the marble floor of the grand foyer, but the sharp sound was entirely lost in the overwhelming chaos of the raid. Silas expertly toggled the camera feeds, tracking the lead federal agent as he marched directly through the massive glass front doors, flanked tightly by a squad of grim state troopers. At that exact moment, the heavy wooden doors of the formal dining room swung wide open. Preston and Garrett Kane stepped out into the main hallway, completely oblivious to the catastrophic reality unfolding just a few feet away. Preston was still clutching his leather portfolio, his face flushed with the temporary, arrogant high of his completely fraudulent corporate victory. He was actively speaking to Garrett, likely offering a smooth excuse for the sudden, inexplicable financial delay, when he finally looked up and registered the overwhelming presence of federal law enforcement occupying his grand foyer. The smug, incredibly arrogant smile on my son's face did not immediately vanish. Instead, it slowly mutated into a mask of supreme, deeply insulated corporate privilege. He honestly believed he was completely untouchable. He assumed this was a minor misunderstanding, perhaps a routine noise complaint generated by a jealous neighbor, or a simple clerical error regarding the catering permits. He confidently adjusted the lapels of his expensive custom-tailored suit and walked directly toward the lead federal agent, projecting the exact same smooth, rehearsed charm he had used to deceive me for months. "Officer, there must be some kind of massive misunderstanding here," Preston announced loudly, his voice echoing with arrogant authority. "I am the Chief Executive Officer of Copper State Logistics. We are currently hosting a highly private elite corporate event. I demand to know exactly who authorized this aggressive intrusion onto my personal property." The lead agent did not slow his incredibly deliberate pace. He stopped merely 2 feet away from my son, his posture radiating absolute unyielding authority. Preston reached into his tailored jacket pocket and quickly extracted the folded notarized copy of the medical power of attorney he carried everywhere, like a protective shield. He aggressively shoved the fraudulent document toward the chest of the federal agent. "I have the absolute legal authority to conduct business here," Preston insisted, his voice rising in desperate fabricated indignation. "I am the sole legal conservator for my father's entire estate. Whatever banking error triggered your system is completely invalid. Check the legal signatures yourself. You have absolutely no jurisdiction to interrupt this private commercial transaction." The federal agent did not even glance at the heavy parchment paper trembling in my son's outstretched hand. He stared directly into Preston's widening eyes with an expression of cold professional disgust. "Preston Calder," the agent stated, his voice a deep, booming baritone that instantly silenced the entire sprawling mansion. "You are currently under formal federal arrest for the commission of massive interstate wire fraud, international money laundering, severe corporate espionage, and the deliberate malicious forgery of binding legal medical documents." The agent smoothly reached down to his tactical belt and unclipped a pair of heavy polished steel handcuffs. The sharp metallic clinking sound completely destroyed the final lingering remnants of Preston's corporate illusion. Garrett Kane, the ruthless corporate predator who had been standing right behind my son, instantly recognized the catastrophic legal peril. He physically stepped backward, completely severing his proximity to Preston, his face twisting into a mask of furious, highly calculated preservation. He realized he had been expertly conned into participating in a massive federal crime. Preston finally panicked. The smooth, rehearsed corporate facade completely shattered, revealing the terrified, deeply cowardly boy hiding underneath the expensive suit. He frantically looked around the crowded room, desperately seeking any form of validation from the wealthy strangers watching his utter humiliation. He raised his hands, screaming at the top of his lungs. "This is an absolute mistake. My father is severely demented. Oh, call the authorities in Cleveland right now. He is completely incapacitated. He absolutely does not know what he is doing. I am the only one trying to save his legacy. He is completely out of his mind." His voice cracked with absolute miserable desperation as the federal agents aggressively grabbed his arms. He continued to scream his vicious fabricated narrative, desperately clinging to the false medical diagnosis he had purchased. He genuinely believed that maintaining the elaborate lie could somehow magically pause the devastating federal raid. I sat in the dark surveillance van listening to his desperate, pathetic lies echoing through the digital audio feed. I slowly reached forward and powered down the glowing tactical monitors. I turned to Silas and gave him a single definitive nod. I reached for the heavy metal handle of the vehicle. Suddenly, the large sliding doors of the blacked-out surveillance van parked directly across the street from the mansion slid completely open. The heavy, dry evening air immediately surrounded me, but I felt absolutely nothing except the pure, unadulterated ice flowing through my veins. Silas silently flanked me, his posture rigid and highly alert, carrying the physical documentation of my son's ultimate destruction in a slim tactical briefcase. I paused for a fraction of a second at the edge of the street, allowing the blinding red and blue lights of the federal cruisers to wash over me. I was not wearing the loose, comfortable clothing of a frail, failing old man. I was wearing a meticulously tailored charcoal gray bespoke suit that I reserved exclusively for corporate warfare. My posture was perfectly straight, my shoulders squared, and my mind was sharper than it had been in 3 decades. I took a deep, measured breath, feeling the tremendous power of absolute clarity, and I began my steady march up the long, sweeping, circular driveway of the stolen mansion. The chaotic scene unfolding on the manicured front lawn began to shift the moment my physical presence registered within the perimeter. The armed federal agents, who had been actively managing the bewildered crowd of wealthy socialites, instinctively parted to allow me passage. They recognized the unmistakable aura of absolute authority. The heavy crunch of my leather soles against the pristine white gravel seemed to echo louder than the wailing sirens in the distance. The affluent party guests, the local investors, and the elite social circle that Preston had so desperately tried to impress, all turned to stare at me. They had just spent the last 2 hours listening to Corinne spin a tragic, highly fabricated tale about my severe cognitive decline. They had been told I was completely incapacitated, a shattered shell of a man, confined to a locked room in Cleveland. Now they were staring directly at a formidable corporate titan, radiating lethal, unapologetic power. A collective, audible gasp rippled through the beautifully dressed crowd. I kept my eyes locked straight ahead, ignoring the stunned whispers and the frantic murmurs. As I approached the massive marble steps leading to the grand foyer, I finally caught sight of Corinne. She was standing frozen near one of the towering stone pillars. Her perfect, highly manicured exterior had completely disintegrated. Her expensive designer gown seemed to hang awkwardly on her trembling frame. She was staring at me with wide, completely terrified eyes, the shattered remnants of a crystal champagne flute resting in a glittering puddle at her feet. She had just realized that her declined premium credit card was not a simple banking error. It was the opening salvo of a completely orchestrated financial apocalypse. I did not offer her a single glance of recognition. I simply walked past her, ascending the marble steps and crossing the threshold into the blindingly bright foyer. The massive interior of the mansion was a chaotic tableau of federal law enforcement and corporate panic. Garrett Kane, the aggressive chief executive officer of Vertex Global, was actively shouting at his two panicked corporate lawyers, demanding they immediately contact his private jet pilot. He was desperately trying to extract himself from the massive federal crime scene, violently severing every single operational tie to the ruined logistics company he had just attempted to purchase. But my singular focus remained entirely on the young man standing in the very center of the room. Preston was completely frozen in the tight grip of two towering federal agents. The heavy steel handcuffs gleamed harshly under the massive crystal chandelier. The blood had entirely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly translucent shade of pale gray. His mouth was hanging slightly open, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths, as his panicked mind desperately tried to comprehend the absolute impossibility of my physical presence. I was the ghost he had confidently buried in a fabricated medical grave, and I had just walked through his front door to personally oversee his burial. I walked deliberately across the polished marble floor. Preston's terrified eyes tracked my every single movement, silently begging for a rescue he absolutely did not deserve. I stopped mere inches from him, but I completely ignored his existence. I acted as if the trembling boy in the expensive suit was nothing more than a piece of broken, discarded furniture. I turned my body slightly and directed my undivided attention exclusively to the lead federal agent, the stern man who had just placed my son under formal arrest. The seasoned agent squared his shoulders, his hand resting cautiously near his tactical belt as he evaluated my sudden intrusion. "Sir, this is an active federal crime scene," the agent stated, his deep voice echoing with rigid authority. "I need you to step back immediately and identify yourself." I looked directly into his eyes, projecting the calm, unyielding dominance I had cultivated over a lifetime of corporate warfare. "My name is Everett Calder," I stated clearly, ensuring my voice carried across the silent, captivated room. "I am the sole founder, the absolute owner, and the acting chief executive officer of Calder Global Logistics. I am also the direct victim of the massive, highly coordinated interstate wire fraud currently occurring inside this building." The federal agent blinked, his rigid, professional demeanor faltering for a fraction of a second as he rapidly processed my true identity. He looked from my sharp, commanding posture to the trembling, pathetic figure of my son, instantly recognizing the massive discrepancy between the legal documents and reality. Before the agent could formulate another question, Silas stepped smoothly to my side and opened the tactical briefcase. He extracted the thick, heavy manila folder we had secured from the private medical clinic just an hour earlier. I took the folder and extended it firmly toward the lead investigator. I believe you are looking for the true architect of this particular fraud, I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a finely sharpened blade. Here he is. I strongly advise your forensic accountants to thoroughly review the contents of this specific dossier. Inside, you will find the complete, highly detailed financial routing numbers tracking exactly $10 million stolen from my commercial real estate portfolio. You will also find the definitive, legally verified proof of international money laundering, specifically tracking massive wire transfers sent to an illegal offshore gambling syndicate. The federal agent slowly reached out and took the heavy folder, his sharp eyes scanning the official seals and the comprehensive digital transaction logs visible on the very first page. I continued speaking, refusing to let the heavy silence settle. Furthermore, you will find a fully notarized sworn written confession voluntarily provided tonight by Dr. Halloran. In that legal document, the physician explicitly details exactly how he was aggressively bribed by the individuals residing in this house to entirely fabricate my medical records. The power of attorney, currently resting in your evidence bag, is a complete and total forgery. I am of perfectly sound mind, and I have just personally initiated the federal poison pill protocol that permanently locked down their fraudulent escrow accounts. The absolute finality of my words hung heavily in the dead silence of the grand foyer. The lead agent slowly closed the heavy folder, his expression hardening into a mask of pure, relentless federal justice. He turned his attention back to my son, the grip of the surrounding agents visibly tightening on Preston's arms. The entire house of cards had completely and utterly collapsed, leaving absolutely nothing but the terrifying reality of a lengthy federal prison sentence. Preston finally shattered. The last lingering shred of his arrogant manufactured corporate persona instantly evaporated into thin air. He violently dropped to his knees right there on the cold marble floor, the heavy steel chains of his handcuffs clanking harshly against the polished stone. He looked up at me, tears streaming rapidly down his pale, terrified face. "Dad, please!" he screamed, his voice a pathetic, broken wail that echoed tragically through the massive house. "Please, you have to stop them. We can fix this. I am so sorry. We can explain everything." I slowly looked down at the weeping, pathetic creature, groveling at my leather shoes. I felt absolutely no pity, no lingering paternal warmth, and absolutely no regret. He had willingly chosen the battlefield, and he had foolishly brought a knife to a nuclear war. I stared into his terrified, desperate eyes with an expression of pure, unadulterated ice. "You forgot to tell me you moved, Preston," I whispered softly, ensuring he heard every single devastating syllable. "And I forgot to tell you, I designed the security system you tried to wipe." The chaotic flashing lights of the Sonoran foothills faded into a distant, muted memory hours later, as the heavy, solid steel doors of the massive federal building closed firmly behind me. The jarring transition from the lavish, opulent warmth of their stolen mansion to the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent glare of the government holding facility was immediate and absolute. I walked down the long, sterile corridor with Nathaniel by my side, the rhythmic echoing of my leather shoes against the linoleum floor serving as the only sound in the suffocating quiet. The cold air in the building tasted distinctly of industrial bleach and rigid, uncompromising institutional authority. The lead federal agent, a highly disciplined man who had completely orchestrated the raid with flawless tactical precision, met us near a heavy reinforced security door at the very end of the long hallway. He offered a brief, respectful nod, informing me that I had been legally granted exactly 5 minutes of unrecorded, completely private access before the formal booking and processing procedures officially commenced. I did not require a single second more. I grasped the cold metal handle, pushed the heavy door open, and stepped directly into the cramped, windowless interrogation room. The claustrophobic space was deliberately designed to forcefully strip away any lingering illusions of personal comfort or corporate power. It contained absolutely nothing but a severely scarred, bolted-down aluminum table and 3 rigid metal chairs. Preston and Corinne were seated closely together on the far side of the cold table, looking exactly like shattered, hollow reflections of the highly arrogant socialites who had confidently hosted a lavish gala just hours prior. The expensive, custom-tailored tuxedo Preston had worn so proudly was now violently wrinkled and deeply disheveled, the silken bow tie completely discarded. Corinne sat silently beside him, shivering visibly in the harsh, freezing air conditioning, her extravagant designer gown looking utterly absurd and entirely pathetic in the bleak, sterile environment. The heavy steel handcuffs binding their wrists clinked sharply against the metal table as they simultaneously looked up at my unexpected entrance. The absolute, unadulterated terror radiating from their bloodshot eyes was physically palpable, forming a thick, suffocating aura of undeniable guilt and profound regret. They had spent long, deceitful months treating me like a completely disposable, incompetent burden, aggressively pushing me toward a terrifying, heavily medicated medical oblivion. Now the overwhelming weight of their catastrophic failure was physically crushing them under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights. I did not sit down. I stood tall and rigid on my side of the aluminum table, projecting the absolute freezing dominance of a man who had successfully navigated the darkest corporate waters for over 3 decades. Preston broke the heavy silence first, his voice a frantic, desperate whisper, completely devoid of any remaining dignity or pride. "Dad, you have to listen to me," he pleaded, leaning forward as far as the heavy steel chains would possibly allow. "This entire situation is a massive, horrific mistake. I never wanted any of this to escalate to this catastrophic level. It was not my fundamental idea to bypass the standard corporate succession protocols." He frantically gestured toward the trembling woman sitting beside him, his baseline survival instincts instantly overriding any lingering marital loyalty. It was Corinne. She was the one who aggressively pushed the accelerated acquisition timeline. She found the corrupt doctor in Phoenix. She made the illegal offshore wire transfers while I was completely focused on managing the daily operations of the logistics company. I was just trying to protect our family assets from corporate stagnation. Dad, I was trying to build something much bigger for all of us. She manipulated the medical paperwork to gain absolute leverage. I swear to you, on my life, I never truly intended to permanently lock you away in a facility. Corinne violently turned her head toward him, her tear-streaked face twisting into a mask of pure, absolute shock and profound marital betrayal. She could not believe her husband was so quickly and ruthlessly throwing her directly to the federal wolves to save his own skin. She immediately turned her desperate, crying eyes toward me, instinctively employing the ultimate emotional shield she believed would somehow guarantee her absolute safety. "Everett, please, you cannot possibly let them do this to us," she sobbed, her voice trembling with manufactured, highly dramatic hysteria. "I am carrying your grandchild. I am currently pregnant. You cannot allow the mother of your only grandson to be locked inside a miserable federal penitentiary. The severe stress of this entire ordeal is going to cause immense harm to the baby. We made a terrible, incredibly stupid mistake, but we are still a family. You have the ultimate legal power to stop this federal investigation right now. Please, Everett, for the sake of the innocent child growing inside me, you have to demonstrate some human mercy and make these federal agents drop the severe criminal charges immediately. I stared at them with an expression of pure, unadulterated ice. My heart did not soften at the desperate mention of the unborn child. It only hardened my absolute resolve to completely neutralize the incredibly toxic environment they had willfully created. I reached inside my tailored suit jacket and slowly withdrew a thick, heavy manila envelope. I did not speak a single word as I deliberately opened the flap and began to systematically drop the devastating physical evidence directly onto the cold metal table. First, I dropped a series of high-resolution photographs detailing the specific chemical sedatives Corinne had been secretly crushing into my evening meals. Second, I dropped the flawless printed copies of the completely fabricated cognitive assessments signed by Dr. Halloran, perfectly displaying their malicious intent to officially declare me mentally incompetent. Finally, I dropped the heavily encrypted banking logs, proving the $150,000 offshore wire transfer used to illegally bribe the desperate gambling-addicted physician. The undeniable proof of their profound, calculated evil covered the aluminum surface like a scatter of toxic ash. "You did not just try to casually rob me, Preston," I stated, my voice a deadly echoing whisper that completely filled the cramped room. "You did not just attempt to aggressively usurp my corporate position. You deliberately poisoned my food. You willfully tried to lock me inside a sterile asylum to rot for the rest of my natural life, while you confidently spent my entire legacy." Preston stared at the damning photographs, his chest heaving with frantic, incredibly shallow breaths. The absolute terrifying reality of his inescapable situation finally suffocated his remaining pathetic hope. "What happens to us now?" he asked, his voice completely hollow and physically trembling with absolute paralyzing dread. I reached into the very back of the heavy manila envelope and slowly extracted 2 final, officially stamped legal documents. I decisively slid them across the cold metal table until they rested directly over the heavy steel chains of their handcuffs. "These are the formal, legally binding bankruptcy filings for your fraudulent company Copper State Logistics," I declared coldly, watching his eyes widen in pure despair. "And resting directly beneath them is the immediate, non-negotiable foreclosure notice for your stolen Phoenix mansion." The suffocating silence inside the cold, sterile interrogation room stretched into an absolute eternity. Preston stared blankly at the formal bankruptcy documents and the harsh foreclosure notice resting on the scarred aluminum table. The undeniable physical proof of his total ruin lay directly over his chained hands. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry, pathetic wheeze escaped his throat. Corinne simply buried her face in her trembling hands, her elaborate designer gown shaking with heavy, uncontrollable sobs. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I did not offer a final dramatic parting statement. I simply turned my back on the 2 people who had so callously plotted my complete destruction. I walked deliberately toward the heavy steel door, my leather shoes clicking sharply against the sterile floor. The lead federal agent was waiting right outside in the brightly lit corridor. He gave me a brief, highly professional nod as I stepped out, silently signaling that my allotted 5 minutes were officially over. The heavy door slammed shut behind me, with a loud, absolute finality, permanently severing my physical connection to the son I had raised. The federal justice system operated with a ruthless, methodical efficiency over the following several weeks. The massive mountain of flawless evidence we had meticulously provided left absolutely no room for any clever legal maneuvers or highly paid defense attorneys. The federal hammer dropped with terrifying, inescapable force. Preston and Corinne were officially and completely indicted by a federal grand jury on multiple extremely severe felony charges. The primary charges included massive interstate wire fraud, international money laundering, severe corporate espionage, the deliberate forgery of binding legal medical documents, and a highly specific, devastating charge of conspiracy to commit elder abuse. The federal prosecutors were absolutely relentless, refusing to offer any lenient plea deals or quiet settlements, because they had aggressively attempted to compromise the integrity of the federal banking system while simultaneously perpetrating a profound domestic evil. The presiding judge showed absolutely zero mercy. My son and his incredibly treacherous wife were both facing a highly probable sentence of up to 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The sprawling, stolen mansion in the Sonoran foothills was immediately seized and locked down by federal marshals. The exotic sports cars, the expensive designer jewelry, and the vast accounts of stolen corporate capital were completely liquidated to fulfill the massive legal fines and profound restitution orders. They were stripped of absolutely everything they had stolen, left with nothing but the bleak, terrifying reality of their incredibly long incarceration. Back in the highly secure, familiar environment of my corporate headquarters in Cleveland, I initiated the absolute final phase of my strategic retaliation. I sat in my expansive sunlit office on the 50th floor, looking across the polished mahogany desk at Nathaniel Rourke. My most trusted, ruthlessly efficient corporate attorney had already drafted the massive stack of complex legal documents required to completely erase my son from my life. I systematically and legally dissolved every single personal and financial tie to Preston. I removed his name from every corporate charter, every family trust, and every single historical document regarding the foundation of Calder Global Logistics. I actively erased him from my legacy, with the exact same cold, calculated efficiency he had used when he attempted to lock me away in a heavily medicated oblivion. It was a completely clinical necessary procedure to permanently eliminate a highly toxic infection from the healthy body of my sprawling corporate empire. Every single share of stock, every future dividend, and every trace of his previous executive authority was officially revoked, heavily notarized, and formally processed by the federal courts. He was no longer my successor. He was officially a complete stranger. However, I absolutely refused to allow their unborn child to suffer the ultimate catastrophic consequences of their profound moral failure. I instructed Nathaniel to establish a completely new, hyper-secure, completely untouchable financial trust fund exclusively dedicated to the unborn grandchild. The ironclad legal stipulations attached to this specific trust were incredibly rigid and utterly non-negotiable. The vast capital within the account could only ever be utilized for verified educational expenses and critical medical care. Furthermore, I explicitly appointed Nathaniel Rourke as the absolute sole administrator of the entire fund. Preston and Corinne would never possess the legal authority to access, view, or touch a single solitary penny of that money. The child would eventually be provided with a pristine, fully funded pathway to a highly successful life, completely insulated from the toxic, greedy influence of the people who had brought him into the world. It was the absolute maximum extent of my lingering compassion. I was securing the future of the innocent bloodline while simultaneously ensuring the complete, unending financial starvation of the treacherous parents. They would watch their child thrive from behind heavy iron bars, knowing they could never personally exploit a single fraction of that incredible wealth. With the complex legal paperwork officially signed, formally sealed, and securely filed away in the deepest corporate vaults, my mission was finally and completely accomplished. I left the towering glass and steel architecture of my corporate headquarters and rode in absolute silence to the private aviation terminal at the international airport. The sleek, heavily customized Gulfstream jet was already idling on the pristine tarmac, the twin engines whining with a powerful, reassuring hum. Silas was standing near the gleaming boarding stairs, his posture relaxed, but highly alert, offering a silent nod of profound respect as I approached. I climbed the stairs with a steady, incredibly strong stride, feeling completely rejuvenated and entirely free from the suffocating weight of their toxic deception. The oppressive, manufactured fog that had clouded my daily existence for so many agonizing months was completely gone, completely replaced by the incredibly sharp, vibrant energy of absolute total victory. I settled into the luxurious cream-colored leather seat by the large oval window. The highly attentive flight attendant immediately handed me a crystal glass of sparkling water, but I gently waved it away. I simply wanted to sit in the absolute quiet of the pristine cabin. The powerful jet smoothly accelerated down the long runway, pushing me firmly back into the plush leather seat as we rapidly ascended into the clear, bright afternoon sky. I leaned slightly toward the thick, reinforced glass window, staring intently downward at the sprawling, bustling landscape rapidly shrinking beneath the wide silver wings. I watched in absolute silence as the expansive sunlit Phoenix skyline slowly faded away into the distant, hazy horizon. The towering glass buildings, the sprawling luxury estates, and the deeply painful memories of my son's catastrophic betrayal were completely and utterly left behind, forever banished to the harsh, unforgiving chapters of my past. I slowly took a very deep, incredibly satisfying breath of the perfectly filtered, cool cabin air, feeling a profound sense of absolute, unshakable peace completely wash over my entire being. The sprawling multi-billion-dollar global corporate empire I had bled to build was completely safe, totally secure, and forever untainted. But the toxic, poisonous, deeply infected branch of my own personal family bloodline was finally completely, fully, and permanently severed. The quiet descent of my sleek, powerful private jet into the cool, refreshing air of the Cleveland skyline marked the absolute definitive end of a deeply agonizing chapter. The flashing chaos of Arizona and the desperate, pathetic pleas of my treacherous son were now entirely confined to the past, locked safely away alongside the federal indictments and looming bankruptcy filings. A black town car transported me from the isolated aviation terminal directly to my sprawling, heavily secured estate in Shaker Heights. As the heavy reinforced gates parted, an overwhelming wave of absolute peace washed over me. I stepped into the midnight air, my leather shoes crunching softly against the pristine driveway, and walked directly into the grand, brightly lit foyer of my home. The expansive historic house was entirely silent, but it was a deeply comforting, profoundly secure silence. There were no hidden enemies lurking in the hallways. There was absolutely no one secretly crushing dangerous sedatives into my evening meals. There were absolutely no greedy, impatient heirs plotting my downfall. The suffocating atmosphere of manipulation had been surgically eradicated. I walked slowly through the familiar corridors, finally arriving at the heavy oak doors of my primary executive office. I pushed them open and stepped into absolute security. I moved deliberately across the plush carpet and settled deeply into the heavy leather chair positioned behind my massive desk. The soft glow of the brass lamp illuminated the immaculate surface, casting comforting shadows across the quiet room. I leaned back, closing my eyes for a long moment, allowing the reality of my survival to fully integrate into my body. I had spent exhausting months actively questioning my own sanity, wondering if the terrifying shadows in my peripheral vision were the early signs of terminal neurological decline. My son and his wife had callously weaponized my deepest fears, actively trying to drag me into a medicated oblivion simply to feed their insatiable greed. But I had not merely survived their vicious psychological warfare. I had absolutely decimated their entire operation by completely trusting my sharp intellect over my vulnerable paternal emotions. I had utilized the exact same cold, ruthless corporate strategy that had originally built my massive empire to dismantle the internal threat. I had successfully treated my own blood like a hostile takeover. I opened my eyes and looked directly at the delicate silver frame resting on the corner of my heavy desk. The photograph captured my late wife, Margot, smiling brilliantly on a sunlit beach during our 25th wedding anniversary. I reached out and gently traced the cool edge of the polished silver frame, feeling a deep, profound ache resonate within my chest. Margot and I had spent our entire lives meticulously building this massive corporate legacy, dreaming of the day we would proudly hand the reins over to our capable son. We had foolishly believed that our unconditional love and vast financial resources would completely shield him from the corrupting influences of the world. We never anticipated that the fatal corruption would bloom entirely from within his own greedy heart. Looking at her beautiful face, I silently promised Margot that I had made the only possible choice. Severing the toxic bloodline was an agonizing necessity, but it was the only way to genuinely protect the prosperous empire she helped me build. I slowly pulled my hand away from the silver frame and reached toward the heavy crystal decanter resting on a polished tray near the edge of the desk. I removed the glass stopper and carefully poured a generous measure of 20-year-old neat scotch into an intricately cut crystal tumbler. The rich amber liquid caught the soft light of the desk lamp, swirling smoothly against the thick glass. I raised the heavy tumbler and took a slow, deliberate sip. The dark, complex liquor burned pleasantly as it slid down my throat, spreading a deep, comforting warmth throughout my chest. The rich taste was a sharp, grounding contrast to the freezing, absolute coldness I had actively maintained throughout the ruthless execution of my elaborate retaliation strategy. For the first time since this terrifying ordeal began, I allowed the rigid protective armor surrounding my heart to subtly relax. The massive corporate war was definitively over. I set the crystal glass down on a thick leather coaster and pulled a heavy embossed leather folder directly into the center of my mahogany desk. Nathaniel Rourke had ensured the finalized legal documents were securely delivered and waiting for my immediate attention. I opened the heavy folder, revealing the crisp, freshly printed pages, requiring my final executive signature. The very first document was a highly specific financial authorization. It was a completely irrevocable, legally binding directive transferring exactly $5 million from my primary holding accounts directly to a highly verified, internationally recognized dementia medical research facility. A small, deeply ironic smile played across my lips as I retrieved my heavy gold fountain pen. Preston and Corinne had cruelly attempted to use the terrifying specter of severe cognitive decline as a weapon to destroy my life. Now I was utilizing my vast wealth to actively fight the very disease they had so eagerly faked. It was poetic justice. I signed my name with bold, incredibly sharp, completely steady strokes. I carefully set the donation authorization aside and turned my full attention to the second critical document resting inside the leather folder. This paperwork represented the immediate essential future of Calder Global Logistics. It was a formal binding executive contract officially promoting Adrian Whitlock to the highly coveted position of Chief Operating Officer. Adrian was a brilliant, incredibly loyal, fiercely dedicated executive who had worked tirelessly within my corporation for over 15 years. He shared absolutely no biological connection to my family, but he possessed the exact type of honorable, unwavering character that my own son completely lacked. By officially elevating Adrian to the primary leadership role, I was sending a massive, undeniable message to the entire corporate world. True, lasting loyalty is strictly earned through years of dedicated, honest action, not simply inherited through the arbitrary luck of a biological bloodline. I signed the heavy executive contract with a profound, deeply satisfying sense of absolute certainty, formally securing the bright, prosperous future of my massive corporate empire. I placed the gold fountain pen back into its velvet-lined case and leaned back into my thick leather chair. I picked up my crystal glass and took another long, deeply satisfying sip of the aged scotch. The glittering, breathtaking expanse of the Cleveland skyline stretched out directly before me, a magnificent sea of bright lights, completely defying the darkness of the night. I am exactly 70 years old today, and I am finally free. The agonizing, destructive storm of deception and betrayal has entirely passed, leaving behind a beautifully clear sky. The empire I meticulously built is safe from internal destruction. The greedy traitors have been permanently, irrevocably expelled from my kingdom. As I sit in the comforting, peaceful silence of my deeply secure sanctuary, I realize the absolute most empowering truth of all. My life is entirely, undeniably, and completely my own again, and it will remain mine until the very end. The hardest truth a parent can face is that blood does not guarantee loyalty, and unconditional love should never mean unconditional blindness. We spend our entire lives building a legacy to protect our children, but sometimes we must build solid walls to protect ourselves from them. Greed can turn the people you raised into strangers, who see you only as an obstacle to your wealth. Never ignore your gut feeling, never sign away your independence, and always verify what happens under your own roof. True family respects your dignity. Those who plot in the shadows only respect your bank account. If this story opened your eyes, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Have you ever experienced a shocking betrayal from someone you trusted completely? Tell me your story in the comments below and let me know what city you are watching from today. Stay sharp, stay safe.